Good evening. Tonight we open one of the greatest stories ever told, a story of gods and mortals, of pride and desire, of fire and ruin. It is the story of Troy, a city whose name has echoed for 3,000 years. Draw closer to the hush between day and night, to that thin blue hour when memory feels like a shoreline and stories come in on the tide. On a windswept rise above the Dardanelles, on the western lip of today's Turkey-weathered stones keep their vigil. They do not shout, they do not explain. Yet in their chipped faces there lingers a pressure, as if 1,000 years of footfalls and farewells are still travelling through the rock. People call the place Hisarlik, others, more dream-struck, still whisper a different name, Troy. Here, wind fingers the grass where ramparts once cast long shadows. Here, sea light tints the hills the colour of old bronze. And from here, a path runs backward, into a world where men fought to be remembered, and the gods, jealous of silence, refused to be absent from human grief. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story you know and the place you can walk are not identical, and yet they touch. The tale arrived to us riding the breath of singers who memorized more than any library could hold, carrying whole wars in the pulse of their verse. Centuries later, those songs were written down and given a poet's authority. We call him Homer, though the name may be a mask worn by many voices lined up behind one lyre. His epics speak in a cadence that sounds like surf, a forward surge, a careful drawback, a shimmer of detail, shields like suns, spearheads glittering, a king's pause before he says the thing that changes the air in the room. The Iliad does not tell of the first ship launched or the last wall falling. It sets you down in medias res, right in the heat, and trusts you will learn the climate by how men sweat and pray. But before the bronze clatters and the smoke stings your throat, before the names Achilles and Hector become weights on the tongue, the road begins where many tragedies do, in a room of light, with music rising, and a single slight that no one thought would matter as much as it did. Picture it. Not a battlefield, but a feast. A mortal king, Peleus, whose reputation has the bright rim of a blade. A sea nymph, Thetis, silver-footed, flaring like a fish turning in deep water. Their union itself is a solved riddle rare, glittering. The noise of two realms briefly agreeing on a single song. The hall swells with colour, crimson and saffron, bronze and lapis. Apollo's hands move like light over the strings. Dionysus sees that wine moves as freely as rumour. Poseidon brings gifts that smell faintly of salt and storm. Hera sits with the upright gravity of a queen who remembers everything. Athena watches with grey eyes that weigh not beauty but intention. Zeus reclines already imagining the thunder he won't have to spend tonight. The tables groan with roasted meats. The air has that festival, heat that makes laughter stick to skin. In the corners stand the watchful ones, minor gods, household attendants, mortal princes cataloguing who smiled at whom and how long. Banquets in the old world are never just banquets. They are contracts disguised as joy. Alliances made credible by shared bread, rivalries muted beneath flattery, a ladder of honour inlaid into the seating. To be welcomed is to be taken into a net of obligations. To be excluded is a wound. That is why, when Eris the goddess, who walks with a coin in one palm and a quarrel in the other, does not receive an invitation, the omission carries more weight than a door quietly closing. In the Bronze Age imagination, hospitality Xenia binds hosts and guests under Zeus's eye. Spurn a guest, and you offend the god. Spurn the goddess whose portfolio is discord, and you are writing your next decade in ash. So Eris arrives anyway, not in fury but with precision. She does not overturn the tables. She does not shout. She takes from her cloak a single object, a golden apple. Its surface looks poured out of sunlight. On its skin is carved a short, polished insult that masquerades as a compliment. For the fairest. She rolls it. It travels like a hush does cleanly, irresistibly picking up the attention of the room as it glides. It stops before three figures who, even seated, seem to radiate different temperatures of command. Hera, wife to the Thunderer, heavy with the authority of marriage and house and crown. Athena, shrewd and battle-wise, the chill and clarity of strategy caught in her gaze. Aphrodite, laughter-loving, the ache of long summers trailing behind her like perfume. You feel at once how small the word fairest is, and how lethal. Choose, says the apple. But Zeus, who knows what choosing means in a room where choice is always a blade laid on someone else's throat, raises his palm and declines. The king of gods has learned the one lesson even kings most dread, that some judgments cannot be rendered without burning down your own house. So he points away from the high table, toward the slopes of Mount Ida, to a shepherd prince who has not yet learned how thick the air grows when divinity leans over your shoulder. Before we follow Hermes down the mountain path, there is something worth noticing. Stories are not simply told, they tell us how to feel about the world. In the old Greek mind, beauty is not detachable from destiny. To call something kalos is to nod toward the order of the universe. So the argument over the apple is not merely about vanity. It is about power's costume, whether it looks like compliance or command, like wisdom or charm. Hera's offered dominion over men is an argument for law. Athena's victory and cunning is an argument for technique. Aphrodite's love announces itself as merely a feeling, and therefore harmless, but it is an invitation to the oldest empire, where one heart is a city, and a glance is a siege engine. The feasting hall hums with the knowledge never admitted, always felt that you cannot praise any of these goods without insulting the others. That is the geometry Eris traces with an apple. On Ida's slopes, a young man watches sheep. He has a face that might have been carved to make the word judge look optimistic. He is called Paris, though when he was born his parents named him Sorrow. Before he ever touched a flute or learned to read the weather in a cloud's torn hem, his mother dreamed a torch set Troy on fire. Dreams in this world are not private accidents, they are dispatches. Priam, king of the city, heard the dream and took the kind of action kings take when they fear prophecy more than guilt. He ordered the infant exposed to let the hills do what kings cannot be seen to do. A shepherd found a bundle of noise and hunger and decided not to let the wind write the last line. Years pass. The boy grows into the kind of beauty that makes strangers guess he must be someone's lost son. He learns the mountain's habits. He blooms into the kind of ease that makes decision look like instinct. Now Hermes arrives, not walking so much as arriving. The way a clear thought does, followed by three beings so intensely present that the air seems to stand aside for them. Hera speaks first, not loud, but with the authority of someone unused to rehearsing her reasons. Choose me, she says, and you will not count your cities, others will. You will look out from high places and see borders threaded with your banner. You will sit where rivals come to swallow their insults and ask for terms. Athena steps into the space Hera leaves and makes it a map. Choose me. Your hand will know how to place a spear where it ends a war. Your mind will see patterns in dust and hoofprints. You will carry wisdom like a second shield. Glory will not be a noise. It will be a measurement, precise and permanent. Aphrodite smiles in a way that makes both offers look like the wrong kind of distance. Choose me, she says softly, and it is astonishing how this voice carries. And the most beautiful woman in the world will love you, not visit you, not look at you in the marketplace as if something had gone missing inside her. Love you. She lives far from here. She is a queen. Her name is Helen. There are ages of the world in which a man would pick empire and never look back. There are others in which technical mastery feels like immortality's neighbor. Paris is born into neither. He is of that ancient, forever young tribe for whom the promise of love makes the horizon lean closer. He chooses the third apple, that is to say, he hands the first apple to Aphrodite, and in the fine crack of that decision you can hear walls begin to loosen their stones. Hera gathers her fury into something slow-burning and ceremonial. Athena does not threaten, she remembers. Aphrodite, who rarely counts or keeps, remembers this time to pay her debt. When you choose among gods, you do not close a door. You open three. What follows this mountain judgment will feel almost pastoral at first. A prince discovered, a sudden homecoming to Troy's long corridors and sunlit courts, a father who believed he had buried a son and now sees him alive, a city that receives him like rain after poor harvest. Priam's love folds Paris close and does not investigate why the wind seems to change when the boy enters a room. Troy, in these first hours, shines with the particular warmth of things that do not yet know what they cost. The palace is bright with polished wood and copper bowls. The courtyards rattle with laughter. Cassandra, who sees too clearly and is honored for it only in hindsight, draws a breath that will become warning, but her throat is not the place the city listens to. Between these embraces and the first rumor of war, there is one journey that must occur, the voyage west to the Spartan court where Helen lives beside Menelaus, a pragmatic king with a temper like a coal under ash. The Greeks call the code that governs guest and host Xenia. It is older than law and dearer to Zeus than thunder. By it a stranger is washed, fed, and given safety before he is asked his name. To violate that delicate order is to invite the kind of punishment that does not stop with you. When Paris crosses the threshold of Menelaus's hall, when he counts hospitality's invisible braids and runs his fingers along their strength, what sits at table with him is not only meat and wine. It is a vow disguised as bread. It is the echo of suitors who once stood in the same hall to court Helen and swore, at Odysseus's clever prompting, to defend the man who won her hand. The oath was a fence around a woman's future. It was also, though none of them said it, a fuse waiting for someone to light. But that is ahead. For now the hall at Sparta lifts its face to a guest, and Paris, in the cloak of diplomacy and youth, measures a beauty so heavily rumoured it has become its own geography. Ancient singers disagree about how the next moment should be told, because a culture that reveres both choice and compulsion cannot decide whether what controls a life comes from within the ribcage or descends like weather. Some say Helen fell in love, a decision that looks like surrender and is nothing of the sort. Some say Aphrodite kept her promise with a nudge that felt, to the human participants, like recognizing a word they had been trying to recall for years. Some say Paris stole what a host had made safe. All agree that treasure changed hands, that the sea darkened, that a king returned to a bed flung open to salt air and found neither wife nor gold nor patience. All agree that the winds began, on that day, to say a single word over and over, in different accents and climates, until men understood they would have to answer with ships. The apple's arc through the wedding hall has reached its first landing. Back in the room where Peleus and Thetis celebrated, lyres still rest in their cases, and the floor remembers dancing. The old code of feasts, forging peace with meat and music, has already failed to bind the insult that would undo it. Eris, who needed only one gesture to start the avalanche, is nowhere to be seen. And yet everything is still moving the way her hand set it moving. In palaces from Mycenae to Argos, kings step into council light and look older than they did at dawn. On Aulis's beach, a forest of masts is waking in men's imaginations. In Troy, a prince who has not yet learned to hear absence as a sound stands by a window and thinks of the way a woman's name can be a harbour and a storm. When history later touches this tale, when spades bite the earth and scholars argue over burnt layers and the colour of pottery, Some will ask which parts are true. They will be asking without quite saying so. If human suffering requires a receipt, but truth has more than one home. There is the truth of a city that once stood here and burned. There is the truth of what a broken vow feels like in the bones of a people who arrange their cosmos around honor. There is the truth of how a single, beautiful, foolish, fated choice can teach nations to speak in the plural first person, we will go, until the beaches are crowded with the grammar of resolve. Tonight we have not yet reached the beaches. We are in the hall of celebration, and we are on the mountain path, and we are inside a room in Sparta, in which the air is rearranging itself into consequence. The gods, who pretend to prefer hymns but cannot resist a spectacle, have taken their places in the overlooking sky. The mortals are almost ready to do what mortals always do: translate desire into distance, distance into risk, risk into story. The apple has been awarded. The sea is beginning to look like a road, and in the deep, invisible engine room beneath the world, the flywheel of fate makes its first patient turn, the judgment of Paris. The slopes of Mount Ida stretched wide beneath the Anatolian sky, their shoulders cloaked in forests of fir and pine. Here the air was sharper than on the plains below, cool even in the sun, laced with the resin of the trees and the murmur of mountain springs. Shepherds had long led their flocks to graze among the high meadows, listening to the wind whistle in the gullies and to the distant cries of eagles hunting along the cliffs. It was a quiet life, far removed from the marble halls of kings and the noisy councils of princes. Yet it was here, among the simple stones and streams of Ida, that the gods themselves now descended. The youth who watched the sheep that day was known to his neighbours as a herdsman, but his true name was Paris, called also Alexandros. He was tall, his movements graceful, his beauty the kind that seemed unearthly, a detail too perfect for the rough world he lived in. None who passed him suspected that he was in fact a prince of Troy, son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. Few knew that his life had been shadowed by prophecy from the very moment he drew breath. Before he was born, Hecuba had dreamed a dream so vivid it felt like memory. She saw herself giving birth not to a child but to a flaming torch, its fire leaping high and spreading across the rooftops of Troy until the entire city burned to cinders. Dreams were not trifles in that age. They were dispatches from the realm of gods. The seers interpreted this vision with grim certainty. The child she carried would be the ruin of Troy. Priam, terrified, resolved to prevent destiny by cruel means. When Hecuba gave birth to a son, the king commanded that the infant be taken to the slopes of Ida and abandoned, left to die from exposure. But fate is stubborn, and the threads spun by the fates are not so easily cut by human hands. A shepherd stumbled across the crying child wrapped in royal cloth, his skin still flushed with the warmth of life. The man, moved by pity or perhaps guided by forces unseen, carried the infant home and raised him as his own. Thus Paris grew up far from the palace of his birth, among sheep and goats, with only the mountains and the seasons as his teachers. He learned the lay of the land, the gullies where wild boar rooted, the paths of deer, the hidden springs. He became skilled with the lyre, filling the mountain air with music that charmed both men and animals. He was admired for his fairness and even temper. Handsome and strong, he was known in the villages near Ida for his judgments in disputes, settling quarrels among shepherds with wisdom beyond his years. But though Paris seemed destined for a quiet life, destiny itself was not quiet. On that fateful day, Hermes, the fleet-footed messenger of Olympus, appeared on the mountain path. His presence was unmistakable. The gleam of his winged sandals, the flicker of a traveller's cloak, the rod of Odysseus in his hand. Behind him walked three figures whose beauty and majesty bent the very air around them. Hera, queen of heaven, her gaze stern and heavy with authority. Athena, grey-eyed goddess of wisdom and war, her step measured, her face intent. And Aphrodite, golden and smiling, her radiance so soft that it could unmake resolve with a glance. Paris, startled, bowed low. He recognized at once that these were not mortals. Even in his shepherd's life, he knew the tales of the Olympians, but he did not know why they had come to him. Hermes spoke first, his voice brisk but carrying the echo of thunder. "You, Paris of Troy, son of Priam, have been chosen to judge a contest. The goddesses stand before you to settle a matter born at the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis. Eris, goddess of strife, cast among them this golden apple, marked for the fairest. None of the gods would dare decide the claim, for even Zeus himself shrank from naming one goddess fairer than the rest. Therefore it falls to you, a mortal yet royal by birth, to choose. Give the apple to the one you judge the fairest." With these words, Hermes placed the apple in Paris's hands. Its weight was startling, not heavy like stone, but dense with meaning, as though the fruit contained within it the seeds of war itself. Hera stepped forward first. Her robes glimmered like the vault of heaven at sunset. Her voice carried the resonance of queenship and the edge of command. "Choose me, Paris," she said, "and I will make you lord of vast dominions. Not one city, not one kingdom only, but the master of an empire that stretches across the known world. Kings will tremble before you, and nations will kneel. Wealth beyond imagining will pour into your coffers. You will be remembered as the greatest ruler of men." Athena then advanced, her spear gleaming though she did not raise it, her grey eyes piercing. "Choose me, Paris," she said, "and I will grant you wisdom that outshines all mortals. In battle you shall never be defeated. Your strategies will be flawless, your strength unmatched. You will be remembered as the wisest and bravest of warriors, your name sung in every campfire tale, your glory immortal. With my guidance, no enemy shall prevail against you." Finally, Aphrodite approached, her smile disarming, her voice like the murmur of a stream at dusk. "Choose me, Paris," she said softly, "and I will give you not dominion nor wisdom in war, but love. For what is power without warmth at your side? What is victory without joy to share it? Choose me, and I will give you the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, Queen of Sparta, whose beauty is greater than that of all others, will be yours. She will abandon her home and her king to follow you. Her heart will belong to you, and in her gaze you will see the envy of all men." Ow! The words of the three goddesses hung in the air like thunderclouds. Paris felt the weight of choice pressing upon him. On one hand, the grandeur of empire. On another, the brilliance of unmatched wisdom and victory. And on the third, the tender but perilous gift of love, promised by the goddess who could sway hearts with a glance. Hera's offer glittered with power, but power came with burden and ceaseless struggle. Athena's promise was intoxicating, for who would not desire to be unconquered in wisdom and war? But Paris was young, his heart attuned to beauty and desire more than the discipline of thrones or battlefields. Aphrodite's offer pierced him with longing. The thought of Helen, though he had never seen her, filled him with a hunger that made the world tilt. And so Paris made his choice. He extended the golden apple to Aphrodite. The mountain itself seemed to grow quiet, as if holding its breath. Hera's face darkened, her pride wounded beyond forgiveness. Athena's lips tightened, her silence as sharp as any curse. Both turned away, their wrath unspoken but certain. Aphrodite smiled in triumph, her eyes warm with the satisfaction of victory. She leaned close and whispered in Paris's ear, "Helen will be yours, though she is already bound to another. She will leave him for you. That is my gift. Trust in me, and the world's most beautiful woman will follow you across the sea." The goddesses departed, leaving Paris alone once more among his flocks. The sheep grazed quietly, unaware that their shepherd had just shifted the balance of history. Paris held the memory of Aphrodite's words in his heart, a promise sweet and intoxicating, though shadowed by consequences he did not yet see. From this choice, the threads of fate began to twist. Hera's anger would not sleep. Athena's resentment would not fade. Aphrodite's promise would soon be fulfilled, drawing Paris toward Sparta, toward Helen, and toward the spark that would kindle a decade-long war. In the courts of Troy, Priam would soon discover that his son, once thought lost to prophecy, still lived. In Sparta, King Menelaus would soon welcome a Trojan guest beneath his roof, bound by sacred hospitality. And in the heart of Helen, Queen of Sparta, desire and destiny would wrestle, leading her to a decision that no one, whether by choice or compulsion, could undo. On that quiet mountain, a young man had simply handed an apple to the goddess of love. Yet that simple act was like a pebble cast into a still pond. The ripples spread outward, across fields, across seas, across generations. One day, those ripples would strike the walls of Troy, and the sound of bronze upon bronze would drown the quiet of the pastures forever. The abduction of Helen. When Paris left the quiet slopes of Mount Ida, he did not return to his flocks. His path bent instead toward Troy, the city of his birth, where destiny waited to reclaim him. The towers of Troy shimmered in the distance like a crown of stone above the plains. Its markets were alive with the chatter of merchants, its gates thronged with travelers from Asia, the Aegean, and beyond. Troy was no mere stronghold. It was a hub where east and west touched hands, where silks from the east mingled with bronze from the isles, where the wealth of empires passed through its harbours. Priam, the aged but mighty king, sat upon his throne when Paris was brought before him. For a moment, the years fell away, and the stern monarch became simply a father, clutching the son he had once lost to the cruelty of prophecy. Hecuba wept openly, her tears falling upon Paris's hair as she pressed her face against him. The court rejoiced, for it seemed a miracle that fate had spared their prince. Hector, noble and steady, clasped his brother's arm with pride, though his keen eyes measured him carefully. Cassandra, her sight cursed with visions none would believe, shrieked in despair, crying out that Troy was welcoming ruin into its own halls. But her voice, as always, went unheard. Paris basked in the love of his family, in the adoration of a city eager to see their prince restored. Yet beneath the splendour, his heart was restless, drawn again and again to the memory of Aphrodite's promise. Helen, she had said. Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, would be his. It was a promise not lightly spoken, for the goddess of love does not forget her debts. Soon, the chance arose. Troy sent envoys to the kingdoms of Greece, and Priam chose Paris to travel abroad, to carry gifts and words of alliance. But Paris's mind was already set. He would go to Sparta. Sparta itself was a land famed for its stern warriors and its fertile valleys. Within its halls lived Helen, whose beauty was the subject of every song. She was said to have been born of Leda, queen of Sparta, and Zeus himself, who had approached her in the guise of a swan. Whether true or not, her beauty bore the mark of something beyond mortal making. She had been courted by the greatest men of Greece, princes and kings, each eager to claim her. To avoid the bloodshed such rivalry would surely bring, her father Tyndareus had required all her suitors to swear an oath, that they would defend the marriage of Helen, whatever man she chose, and punish any who violated it. Bound by this sacred vow, the princes of Greece had submitted, and Helen had wed Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon. For a time, her life seemed settled, a queen ruling beside her husband in the halls of Sparta. When Paris arrived in Sparta, he came not as a thief, but as a guest. Menelaus welcomed him with courtesy, honouring the sacred laws of hospitality, pouring wine for him at his table, feasting him with roasted meats and music. For days, the Trojan prince enjoyed the comforts of the Spartan court. He spoke with charm and eloquence, winning admiration, yet while he traded words with Menelaus, His eyes drifted again and again toward Helen, and Helen, watching him, could not help but see the grace of youth upon his face, the glow that seemed touched by heaven itself. The poets never agreed on what followed. Some say Helen fell in love with Paris willingly, enchanted not only by his beauty but by the foreign glamour of Troy. Others say Aphrodite clouded her mind, bending her will to fulfill her promise. Still others insisted Paris carried her off against her choice, seizing her as a prize. But whether it was desire, compulsion, or force, the end was the same. Menelaus was called away to Crete to attend funeral rites, leaving Paris as his guest. In his absence, Paris seized the moment. One night, under the shroud of darkness, Helen fled with Paris. With them they carried treasures from Menelaus's palace, gold, jeweled ornaments, and silks fit for queens. Their ship lay waiting, oars ready, sails drawn taut against the sea breeze. When dawn broke, the vessel cut across the waves, its prow pointed east, carrying with it not only Helen and Paris but the spark of war. On deck, Paris stood triumphant, the goddess's promise fulfilled. Beside him, Helen gazed back at the receding shores of Greece. Did her heart beat with passion for the man at her side, or tremble with fear for what she had done? The stories cannot agree. Some say she smiled as the coastline vanished, her eyes filled with fire. Others claim she wept silently, her face hidden beneath her veil. All we know is that she did not remain in Sparta. When Menelaus returned and found his bed empty, his halls stripped of treasure, his wife vanished across the sea, his fury was boundless. To steal a man's wife was insult enough, but to violate the sacred bond of guest friendship, the law of Xenia that Zeus himself protected, was sacrilege. This was not a quarrel between men. It was an outrage before heaven. Menelaus's wrath hardened into resolve. He sent messengers to his brother Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, and reminded him of the oath sworn long ago by Helen's suitors. The time had come to honor it. Across Greece, the call went out. The kings who had once stood as rivals now stood bound by their own vow. Odysseus of Ithaca, though reluctant, could not escape the oath. Ajax the Great, towering in might, and Ajax the Lesser, quick and fierce, prepared their ships. Diomedes of Argos, Idomeneus of Crete, Nestor of Pylos, wise though aged, all pledged to sail. Agamemnon himself, ambitious and ruthless, saw in Helen's abduction not only a wrong to be righted, but a chance to unite Greece under his command and extend his power eastward. So it was that the choice made by a shepherd prince on the slopes of Mount Ida came to weigh upon the entire world of heroes. The ships of Greece began to gather, their black hulls drawn up on the shores, their sails furled like wings waiting for the wind. Men sharpened their spears, women wept at the thought of long partings, and the gods watched with hungry eyes. In the halls of Troy, Helen walked as a new bride beside Paris, dazzling all who looked upon her. Some rejoiced, believing her beauty a triumph for the city. Others muttered that she was a curse, and Cassandra, looking upon her, screamed of fire again, but no one listened. Paris thought himself blessed, for the goddess of love had given him the most coveted woman in the world. But love, when won by divine trickery and mortal betrayal, carried a shadow. Behind them, the sea sighed against the coasts of Greece, carrying the sound of war across the waves. Before them, the towers of Troy shone like gold in the sun, waiting for the ships that would soon darken its shores. The apple had been given, the promise fulfilled, the oath remembered. What began in a wedding hall with a goddess's spite now turned toward the clangor of armies. And Helen, whether lover, victim, or pawn, stood at the heart of it all, the woman whose beauty would set 1,000 ships to sea, and whose presence behind the walls of Troy would draw blood enough to fill the Scamander River red. The rage of Menelaus and the oath fulfilled, When Menelaus returned from Crete and crossed the threshold of his palace, the silence met him first. The hearth was cold, the chambers too still. Then came the servants, their faces pale, their words stumbling over one another, bearing the tale that broke the world. Helen was gone. The queen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda, wife to Menelaus, had fled under cover of night. She was not alone. The Trojan prince, Paris, had stolen her from her halls and carried away treasure besides. What hospitality had offered, treachery had answered. The sacred bond of guest and host, guarded by Zeus himself, had been shattered in a single act. Menelaus stood frozen, his heart clenching with a fury so fierce it seemed the walls themselves trembled. He stormed into the chamber that had been Helen's, seeing her veils cast aside, her jewels missing from their places, the bed still bearing the impression of her absence. Rage and grief mingled until they were indistinguishable. To lose a wife was betrayal enough, but to lose her to a guest was sacrilege. In that moment, Menelaus swore that he would not rest until Helen was returned, until Paris paid, until Troy itself was laid low for daring such an insult. But Menelaus was not a fool. He knew that the task was greater than one man's wrath. Helen had been courted by many kings and princes before she was wed, and each had sworn an oath. Years earlier, when Tyndareus had feared that choosing a husband for his daughter might plunge Greece into civil war, Odysseus had offered a solution. Every suitor, whether chosen or rejected, would swear to defend Helen's marriage, to avenge any insult to her honor. The oath had bound them all before the altars of the gods. And now, that oath would be called upon. Menelaus sent word to his brother Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, who ruled over the richest and most powerful of the Greek kingdoms. Agamemnon's palace gleamed with gold, its walls adorned with the spoils of conquest, its storerooms bursting with treasure. Ambition burned in him like a hidden fire. When he heard of Paris's deed, he did not see only the dishonor done to his brother. He saw an opportunity to unite the fractious Greek princes under one command, his own, and to carry war across the Aegean, where the wealthy cities of Asia Minor lay ripe for conquest. Together, the brothers began to summon the kings of Greece. Messengers were dispatched to every corner of the land, carrying reminders of the oath and demands for action. The call spread like a storm. Helen was stolen. The laws of the gods were broken. The honor of Greece demanded war. From Ithaca came Odysseus, though reluctantly. Clever and wily, he had no desire for war. To avoid it, he feigned madness, yoking a donkey and an ox together to plough his fields and sowing salt instead of seed. But Palamedes, sent by Agamemnon, was not deceived. He placed Odysseus's infant son, Telemachus, in the path of the plough. When Odysseus swerved to save the boy, his sanity was revealed, and he was forced to honor the oath. From Salamis came Ajax the Greater, towering above other men, second only to Achilles in might. His cousin Ajax the Lesser also arrived, swift and fierce in battle though reckless in temper. From Pylos came old Nestor, wise counselor whose experience in war was unmatched, his voice carrying the weight of generations. From Argos came Diomedes, young but fierce, eager to carve his name into memory. From Crete came Idomeneus, seasoned in command, leading his island's warriors across the sea. And then there was Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. Prophecy clung to him like armor. His mother knew that if he went to Troy, he would win glory but lose his life. To save him, she hid him on the island of Skyros, disguised among the daughters of the king, dressed in women's robes. But Odysseus, with his cunning, uncovered the ruse. Disguised as a merchant, he laid out gifts for the maidens, silks, trinkets, jewels, and among them a sword and shield. While the others admired the fabrics, one maiden reached instinctively for the weapons. In that moment, Achilles was revealed. Bound by fate and the pull of glory, he joined the cause, bringing with him his loyal companion Patroclus and his band of myrmidons, fierce warriors whose loyalty was absolute. So the kings gathered, and the ships assembled. From every harbour of Greece, black-hulled vessels were launched into the sea. Their sails, furled tight against the masts, stood like a forest rising from the shore. The clamour of preparation filled the air, the ring of hammers as armour was fitted, the neighing of horses, the shouting of men. Women stood weeping on the beaches, watching husbands and sons depart, not knowing if they would ever return. The greatest host the world had yet seen gathered at AULIS, their numbers so vast the shoreline seemed consumed by ships. Some say they numbered 1,000, others fewer, but all agree the sight was staggering. Prows painted bright, eyes carved into wood to watch the waves, sails waiting for the winds. On the beach, fires burned day and night as the army prepared. Agamemnon strode among them like a king already certain of conquest, his ambitions swelling with the sight of so many lords united beneath his banner. Yet even as they prepared to sail, the gods watched. Hera and Athena, still burning with resentment from Paris's judgment, favoured the Greeks, eager to see Troy humbled. Aphrodite, who had won the apple, stood with Paris and Helen, shielding them with her grace. Zeus, the High Father, remained aloof, unwilling to commit himself fully to either side, though his sympathies often leaned toward the Trojans. From Olympus they watched as men sharpened spears and swore oaths, their rivalries and desires echoing the divine quarrel that had set it all in motion. MENELAUS, standing at the prow of his ship, felt the weight of both fury and purpose. This was no longer only about his wife, no longer only about an insult to his house. The honour of all Greece was bound to Helen. Her absence had become a wound carried by every king, every soldier. To retrieve her was to heal their pride. To fail was to let shame poison their names for generations. And so the oath was fulfilled. What had been sworn in the hall of Tyndareus now drew men from across the land to one cause. A stolen queen had become the excuse, but the truth ran deeper. Ambition, vengeance, pride, the hunger for glory and the promise of plunder. Together they turned their eyes eastward to Troy, where Helen walked among her new hosts, dazzling and dangerous, the prize that would draw the fury of 1,000 ships. The winds had not yet risen, the ships had not yet sailed, but already the world had changed. The choices of gods and the passions of men had set a course that could not be turned back. On the shores of AULIS, under the watchful gaze of the immortals, Greece stood ready to launch itself into legend. The gathering at AULIS and the sacrifice. The shoreline at AULIS was transformed into a forest of masts, each ship drawn up side by side until the bay itself seemed more wood than water. From every kingdom of Greece they had come, answering the oath and the call to arms, their black-hulled vessels rocking gently in the tide. Fires burned across the strand, smoke coiling upward into the salt air. The crash of hammers on bronze mixed with the whinnying of horses and the clatter of hooves. The ground quivered beneath the stamping of thousands of feet. The army of Greece, the greatest ever assembled, stood waiting to launch itself across the wine-dark sea. Each day more kings arrived with their men. They came bearing the standards of their houses, banners snapping in the sea breeze. AJAX, the Greater, towering above other warriors like a living wall of bronze, marched with his 12 ships from Salamis. His cousin Ajax the Lesser came too, fierce and restless, commanding 40 ships of Locrian spearmen. Diomedes of Argos, young and ambitious, led 80 ships, his eyes already lit with the fire of coming glory. Idomeneus of Crete brought 80 more, his men hardened by island wars. From Pylos came wise old Nestor, his 90 ships creaking under the weight of his warriors and their hopes. And at last Achilles himself appeared, the half-divine son of Peleus and Thetis, accompanied by 50 ships of Myrmidons, each warrior sworn to follow him wherever destiny demanded. By his side walked Patroclus, his dearest companion, the quiet shadow to his brilliance. The host swelled until the shoreline itself seemed too small to contain it. By some reckonings they numbered 100,000 men, perhaps more. Spears bristled like reeds in a marsh. Shields gleamed in the sunlight, and the sound of their voices carried across the sea like thunder. Never before had such an army been seen, and never again would such an array of heroes stand together in one cause. But though the men were ready, the winds refused to rise. Days passed, and still the sails hung limp. The sea stretched flat as polished stone, mocking their impatience. The soldiers grew restless, their tempers fraying under the weight of waiting. Some muttered that the gods were withholding their favour, that the expedition itself was cursed. Others whispered of omens, birds flying in strange patterns, dreams of ill portent. Agamemnon, whose pride had swelled with the sight of so many kings under his banner, now felt the first chill of doubt. Without winds, the ships could not sail, and without sailing, the war could not begin. He summoned Calchas, the seer who walked among them, a man who claimed to read the will of the gods in the flight of birds and the smoke of sacrifices. Calchas's face grew grave as he cast his lots and spoke the truth. Artemis, goddess of the hunt and mistress of wild creatures, is angered. Agamemnon, in your arrogance you have slain a stag in her sacred grove. The goddess demands recompense. The winds will not stir until her anger is appeased. She will accept nothing less than the sacrifice of your daughter, Iphigenia. The words fell upon the camp like a curse. Agamemnon's face went pale, his pride shriveling beneath the weight of the demand. His daughter, his own flesh, a young girl innocent of all these quarrels, must be offered like a common animal to the gods. He raged against the prophecy, called Calchas a liar, threatened to scatter the army. But the days dragged on, the winds refused to blow, and murmurs of discontent grew louder. Some kings began to speak of returning home before winter closed the sea. Agamemnon saw his great expedition slipping from his grasp. In desperation, he sent word to his wife, Clytemnestra, commanding her to bring Iphigenia to Aulis. He cloaked his command in lies, claiming that the girl was to be wed to Achilles, the greatest warrior among them. Joyful at the prospect, Clytemnestra set out with her daughter, who came adorned in wedding robes, her face alight with innocence and expectation. When they arrived at the camp, the truth unravelled like a torn veil. Some say Iphigenia realized the horror awaiting her and, with a courage beyond her years, accepted her fate, declaring she would give her life for Greece. Others tell that she was dragged screaming to the altar, her cries drowned by the prayers of priests. Still, another tale claims that at the last moment Artemis herself relented, snatching the girl away in a swirl of mist and leaving in her place a deer, its blood staining the stones instead. Whatever the truth, the winds rose after the sacrifice. Filling the sails that had hung idle for so long, Agamemnon stood broken in spirit, his hands stained with the cost of ambition. Clytemnestra, left behind in Mycenae, carried away a hatred that would one day flower into bloody vengeance. The army, however, rejoiced. The waiting was ended, the expedition secured. The sea no longer mocked them, it beckoned. At dawn, the fleet launched. One after another, the ships slid into the water, their prows cutting through the surf, their sails swelling with the long-awaited wind. The oars beat in rhythm, drums thundered, and the voices of 100,000 men rose in song and battle cries. The bay of Aulis, once choked with ships, emptied as the armada moved eastward, a floating city stretching across the horizon. From the cliffs, those who remained on shore watched the vast host vanish into the haze of sea and sky. Women lifted their hands in farewell. Children cried out for fathers who would not return. The gods looked down from Olympus, some smiling, some frowning, all knowing that the course of fate was set. Paris and Helen stood in Troy, their lives bound together by desire and divine promise. unaware or perhaps uncaring that 1,000 sails now bore down upon them. The choice made on the slopes of Ida, the passion born in the halls of Sparta, had become a tide no walls could resist. The Greeks were coming, their ships darkening the sea, their hearts set on vengeance and honour, their eyes on Troy, the first landing and the beginning of war. The fleet moved across the wine-dark sea like a vast migration of black-winged birds, sails swollen with the breath of the gods, oars dipping and rising in unison to the beat of drums. To those who gazed from the decks, the horizon was filled not with water and sky, but with the endless forms of other ships, each carrying men who had left behind their homes, their fields, their wives, and children for the sake of an oath and a stolen queen. The sea itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of so many vessels, and the spray that rose around their prows glittered like scattered stars. By day, the men rowed and sang, their voices echoing across the waters in rhythms meant to ease the burden of labour. By night, the ships anchored at islands or in quiet bays, fires flaring along the beaches as warriors roasted what game they could hunt, told stories of their homes, and boasted of the glory they would soon win at Troy. Among the kings, councils were held. Agamemnon spoke of order and obedience, always with the edge of command in his voice. Nestor counselled patience, his age lending weight to every word. Odysseus offered clever plans, his mind always seeking advantage. And Achilles, radiant as the dawn, said little, though the other kings could not help but glance toward him, already sensing in him the storm that would one day break the war open. The fleet's journey was not a straight line, but a winding path through islands and coasts. For the sea was no simple road. Winds shifted without warning. Currents tugged at the hulls. Storms threatened on the horizon. At times the fleet scattered, only to regroup at an appointed island. At times they clashed with locals unwilling to offer supplies, and blood stained the sands before the ships moved on. On one such island, Achilles distinguished himself. When ambushed at Tenedos by local defenders, he led a counterattack that scattered the enemy and secured water and provisions. Among the captives he took, there was a maiden named Briseis, who would later become a fateful figure in the long story of the war. But not all went as planned. On the sacred island of Lemnos, the archer Philoctetes, bearer of the great bow of Heracles, suffered a terrible misfortune. Bitten by a serpent while honouring a shrine, his wound festered, producing a stench so foul that his comrades could not bear his presence. Agamemnon, pressed by Odysseus's counsel, ordered him abandoned on the island, left to suffer alone. It was a cruel decision, expedient in the moment, but one that would return to haunt the Greeks in years to come. Philoctetes, groaning on the lonely shore, cursed the ships as they vanished into the horizon. At last, after weeks upon the sea, the fleet sighted the coast of Asia Minor. From the decks, men shaded their eyes against the sun and glimpsed the distant towers of Troy, rising proud above the plain like a crown of stone. The Scamander River wound its glittering path across the fields, and the high walls built by gods seemed to shine in defiance. But the question remained, where to land? Troy's shores were not hospitable, and its defenders surely watched the coast with wary eyes. It was decided that a smaller advance force would attempt the first landing, testing Trojan defences before the full might of the armada descended. At dawn, the prows of a few chosen ships scraped against the sand. Warriors leapt down, shields raised, spears bristling. Among them was Protesilaus, eager for glory, the first Greek to set foot upon Trojan soil. Yet, a prophecy had long foretold that the first to land would also be the first to die. True to fate, even as his feet struck the sand, an arrow flew from the Trojan ranks and pierced him. He staggered forward 3 steps before falling, fulfilling the omen with his blood. Despite his death, the Greeks pressed on, their spears thrusting, their shields locking, until they secured a beachhead. the Trojans fell back toward their city, bearing word of the invasion. From the high towers, watchmen lit fires, signaling the alarm. Within the walls, Hector armed himself, already sensing that this day was the beginning of a storm that would not soon pass. With the first landing secured, the great fleet came in waves. One by one, the ships grounded on the beach, their keels grinding against the pebbles. Warriors poured out, the sand groaning beneath the weight of thousands of feet. Soon the plain between city and sea was filled with tents and palisades as the Greeks raised a fortified camp. Fires burned day and night, cooking the spoils taken from nearby villages. Spears stood planted in the earth, shields leaned against posts, and the air filled with the neighing of horses and the clash of weapons being tested. Yet before the first great battle, words were still attempted. Odysseus and Menelaus, under the banner of truce, walked to Troy's gates, carrying olive branches as symbols of peace. Before King Priam they stood, demanding the return of Helen and the treasures stolen with her. Menelaus's voice rang with fury as he declared his rights, his eyes searching the hall for Helen, though he found only curious Trojan faces. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, spoke of the violation of sacred laws, of the outrage done to hospitality, of the oath that bound all Greece to seek justice. Priam listened, his heart torn between his sense of honor and his love for his son. At last he turned to Paris, and Paris, with Helen at his side, spoke with defiance. "She came willingly," he said. "I will not give her up. What kind of husband would I be if I surrendered my wife to another man? What kind of Trojan would yield what he loves under threat of foreign arms?" The embassage ended in failure. Odysseus and Menelaus returned to the camp with nothing but Troy's refusal. Behind them, Cassandra cried out from the walls, foretelling fire and ruin if Helen remained within the city. But as always, her words were dismissed. The Greeks prepared for war, their camp fortified along the shore, their ships drawn up behind palisades. The Trojans summoned their allies from the surrounding lands, Phrygians, Lycians, and others swell their ranks. Within the city, Helen walked the halls, her presence both a marvel and a curse. Some whispered that she was a goddess in mortal form, others that she was the doom of Troy itself. Wherever she went, eyes followed, and the shadow of coming battle lengthened. The stage was set. The first blood had already been spilled on the sands. The first embassy had failed, and the first warnings had gone unheeded. The armies of Greece and Troy now faced one another across the plain, the sea at the Greeks' backs, the walls of Troy at the Trojans' front. The gods watched from Olympus, their rivalries entwined with those of men, their hands ready to tip the scales. Soon, bronze would clash upon bronze, and the cries of the dying would echo across the plain. What had begun with a golden apple at a wedding feast had now arrived at its inevitable moment. The Greeks had landed, the Trojans had refused, and the long war, destined to last 10 years, was about to begin. The years of raiding and the siege's early stalemate. The first clash upon Trojan soil had been fierce, but it was only a prelude. For though the Greeks had secured their beachhead and driven the Trojans back behind their walls, the city itself stood unbroken. The towers of Troy rose still, proud and defiant, their gates barred, their walls gleaming in the sun with the strength of stone laid by divine hands. The Greeks had come with numbers beyond counting, but no ladder or ram could break those fortifications, and no army, however vast, could breach a city guarded by both skill and gods. And so the war, which many had imagined would be swift, a strike, a victory, a plunder, settled into something slower, heavier, and far more cruel. The plain between city and sea became the stage of endless struggle. Each morning, at dawn, the Greeks marched from their fortified camp, shields upon their arms, spears levelled, their voices raised in cries meant to shake the courage of their foes. From the gates of Troy, Hector led his men to meet them, the horsehair crest upon his helmet catching the light as he rode. Day after day the two armies clashed, surging forward and falling back, until the ground itself seemed soaked with blood that could not be washed away. But for all their might, the Greeks could not storm the walls, and for all their valor, the Trojans could not drive the invaders back into the sea. So the war spread outward, carried like fire to the allies and dependents of Troy. Realizing that a direct assault upon the city might prove impossible, the Greeks turned their fury upon its neighbors. Achilles, hungry for glory and restless beneath the stalemate, led raids along the coasts and across the plains, his myrmidons following him with unwavering loyalty. City after city fell before his spear, 12 taken by sea, 11 by land, according to the old songs. Their walls crumbled, their treasures plundered, their people driven into slavery. It was during these raids that Achilles seized Briseis, the maiden who would later become the spark of a quarrel that shook the Greek camp itself. The spoils of these raids swelled the Greek encampment. Tents grew rich with plunder, golden cups, robes dyed purple, bronze cauldrons, horses sleek and strong, slave women, taken from fallen towns, moved through the camp, serving at fires or warming the beds of warriors. To the common soldier, the war became a harvest of plunder, a chance to win wealth he could never have dreamed of in his village life. Yet still the walls of Troy stood untaken, and each season that passed ground the spirits of men more deeply into the earth. The Trojans, too, suffered. Though their walls protected them, the siege drained their strength. Their fertile fields lay ruined by Greek forays, their villages stripped bare. Caravans that once brought them wealth now faced ambush. Food remained, for Troy had stockpiled heavily in the years before, but luxuries dwindled, and the endless watch upon the walls wore men thin. And always, the shadow of Helen walked their halls. Some cursed her openly, muttering that a single woman was not worth the ruin of a kingdom. Others, beguiled by her beauty, could not look upon her without awe, as though a goddess lived among them. From the high walls, Helen often gazed across the plain, watching the armies meet in their daily dance of blood. Some say she was called upon to name the Greek heroes for Priam, for though the Trojans had never seen them in peace, Helen knew each by face and name. Ajax, massive as a tower; Diomedes, fierce and young, cunning Odysseus, his eyes always darting like a fox. When asked to name Agamemnon, she pointed to the one who towered above the Greeks like a king among kings. When asked for Achilles, she grew quiet, for even then his name carried a kind of thunder. Year after year the pattern repeated. Battles were fought, heroes fell, but no victory was final, no loss decisive. The Greeks grew weary of the endless cycle, their councils filled with bitter arguments. Agamemnon demanded obedience, his pride often clashing with the pride of other kings. Odysseus counseled cunning, urging ambushes and stratagems when brute force failed. Nestor urged patience, reminding them of oaths sworn. And Achilles, though unmatched in battle, grew increasingly disdainful of Agamemnon's arrogance, his own sense of honor clashing with the authority of the high king. Tension simmered, and the gods themselves stoked it, for on Olympus the quarrel of the goddesses still lingered. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, their anger against Paris and Aphrodite burning undimmed. They whispered strength into the arms of Greek warriors, shielded them from fatal blows, turned arrows from their mark. Apollo, god of the bow, lent his favor to the Trojans, striking fear into the Greeks, guiding the spears of Hector and his men. Aphrodite shielded Paris, often too eager to spare him when courage failed. Ares, god of war, swayed from side to side, delighting in the carnage itself rather than in any cause. And Zeus, though he claimed neutrality, watched with an eye that often softened toward the Trojans, allowing the balance of battle to sway back and forth like a scale in the wind. For the men upon the plain, the war became a rhythm of blood and dust. They rose at dawn to the sound of trumpets and marched to fight beneath the walls. They hurled spears, clashed shields, and cried out the names of their fathers as they struck. At dusk they dragged back their dead, lit the funeral pyres, poured libations to the gods, and slept upon the hard ground until the sun rose again. Children born within Troy at the start of the war grew old enough to carry wooden swords upon the walls by its middle years. Children left behind in Greece grew into youths before their fathers returned, if they returned at all. And yet, for all the futility, stories of heroism abounded. Diomedes, in one night raid with Odysseus, captured Dolon, a Trojan spy, and wrung from him secrets of the enemy's allies before ending his life. Ajax, standing like a bulwark, saved countless ships from destruction when the Trojans pressed the camp. Hector, ever noble, rallied his men again and again, a symbol of hope for his city. Even Paris, mocked for his softness, occasionally loosed an arrow that found its mark, though more often it was Aphrodite's hand that guided him out of danger. 8 years passed in this rhythm, years that blurred into one another until even the kings began to despair of ever seeing an end. But fate, which had so far stretched the war into stalemate, was preparing its hand. For into this grinding struggle would soon enter new allies, new prophecies, and quarrels among the Greeks themselves that would burn hotter than their hatred of Troy. And when at last those quarrels erupted, the war would change from a slow siege into a tragedy of wrath and death that no man could turn aside. The prophecy of Rheseus and the night raid. By the 8th year of the war, the plain of Troy had grown weary of blood. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of corpses, and the Scamander River ran red so often that its waters seemed to carry the taste of iron. And yet, despite all this carnage, neither side had prevailed. The Greeks held their fortified camp by the sea, their ships drawn up behind walls of timber, their tents swelling with plunder from raids. The Trojans held their city, its gates closed, its towers unbroken, their hopes resting upon Hector's spear, and the walls that no foe had yet breached. The war had become a cycle, endless and grinding, with no conclusion in sight. It was then that new hope arrived for Troy in the form of allies from distant lands. Messengers had been sent far and wide, calling upon old oaths of friendship, appealing to kinship, and promising wealth and glory to any who would come to aid the beleaguered city. And among those who answered was Rhesus, king of Thrace, whose arrival caused the Trojans to believe, if only for a moment, that their fortune might at last be turning. Rhesus was no common ally. His people were fierce, mountain-born warriors clad in shining armor, their white cloaks flashing like snow as they marched. More marvelous still were his horses, 12 in number, pure white as driven snow, their hooves faster than the storm winds, their manes gleaming like silver beneath the Sunday. They were not mere animals, but creatures touched by the divine, said to be fit for the chariot of a god. And with them came a prophecy, whispered by seers and repeated in hushed tones. If the horses of Rhesus should drink from the river Scamander and graze upon the grass of Troy, then the city would never fall. The Trojans greeted Rhesus with joy, their spirits lifted for the first time in years. The sight of his army entering their camp filled them with renewed courage. At last, it seemed, they had found not only strength but destiny on their side. The Greeks, hearing rumors of the Thracian king's arrival and the prophecy that accompanied him, felt unease stir in their ranks. For if the horses were allowed to drink and graze within Troy's walls, all their toil, all their sacrifices, might prove for nothing. It was Odysseus who first gave voice to the thought that lingered in the minds of many. If those horses enter Troy, he said in the Greek council, we are undone. Better to strike swiftly now, in the darkness, than to meet them in battle at dawn. Diomedes, bold and eager for deeds of glory, seized upon the plan. The two of them, cunning Odysseus and fierce Diomedes, would slip into the Trojan camp under cover of night and cut the thread of fate before it was tied. That night, as the campfires of both armies dwindled and the plain lay shrouded in silence, the two Greeks armed themselves for stealth. Odysseus wrapped himself in a dark cloak, his face shadowed, his mind sharp as ever. Diomedes strapped on his armor but left aside the heavy bronze that would clang and betray him, choosing instead weapons light and swift. They crept through the Greek camp, past the watchfires, past the guards, and into the no-man's land between the armies. The plain was hushed, save for the distant barking of dogs and the cries of owls circling the ruins of old villages. Before they reached the Trojan lines, they encountered a lone figure, moving like a shadow through the night. It was Dolon, a Trojan sent as a spy into the Greek camp. He wore the skin of a wolf upon his back, hoping to slink unnoticed through the darkness. But Odysseus and Diomedes, crouched in the shadows, sprang upon him like lions upon prey. They dragged him to the ground, pressed blades to his throat, and demanded to know his purpose. Trembling, Dolon begged for his life, promising to reveal all he knew if only they would spare him. He told them of Rhesus's camp, of the Thracian warriors sleeping unguarded in their tents, of the white horses tethered nearby, waiting to be led into Troy. Odysseus, his voice as cold as the night air, promised Dolon his life if he spoke the truth. But when the information was given, Diomedes raised his sword and cut him down, declaring that no spy should live to return to his masters. The grass drank his blood, and the two Greeks pressed on. They moved swiftly and silently toward the Thracian camp. The tents of Rhesus and his men lay on the edge of the Trojan lines, for they had only just arrived and had not yet taken their place within the city. The Thracians, weary from travel, slept soundly, their weapons set aside, their armor stacked in gleaming piles. The white horses stood nearby, their eyes reflecting the faint starlight, their breath steaming in the cool night. Diomedes, with the fury of battle in his heart, fell upon the sleeping men, one after another. He drove his spear into their bodies, striking before they could wake, killing them in silence, broken only by the hiss of breath and the gurgle of blood. Rhesus himself was slain in his sleep, never lifting a hand to defend himself, never knowing the treachery that had come for him. The prophecy that had promised Troy's salvation was snuffed out in the darkness before it could even breathe. Odysseus, meanwhile, seized the reins of the divine horses. Their eyes rolled with unease, their hooves striking sparks against the stones. But he calmed them with murmured words and led them away from the camp. When Diomedes at last stepped back from the slaughter, the two fled together across the plain, driving the horses before them, the bodies of Rhesus and his men left strewn behind like broken statues. By dawn, they had returned to the Greek camp, leading the white steeds as proof of their deed. The army rejoiced, their fears of the prophecy lifted, their faith in the cunning of Odysseus and the valor of Diomedes renewed. The horses were tethered near the ships, their beauty a marvel to all who saw them. But in Troy, when the news spread that Rhesus was dead and his horses stolen, despair fell upon the people like a shroud. Their brief hope, the spark that had kindled when the Thracians arrived, was extinguished before it could burn. Cassandra wept, her voice rising in prophecy that no one heeded. Hector clenched his fists, cursing the treachery of the Greeks, vowing to repay blood with blood. Paris, though still gilded with Aphrodite's favour, felt the whispers of shame once more, for it was his desire that had brought these calamities upon his people. The war, which had long circled in endless stalemate, now shifted. The gods had tasted the blood of kings, and their hands stirred restlessly upon Olympus. Soon quarrels would erupt within the Greek camp itself, quarrels born of pride and insult, quarrels that would cost them dearly. For though the Greeks had struck down Rhesus and stolen his divine horses, they could not yet foresee how their own divisions would wound them more deeply than any Trojan spear. The quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles, the Greek camp, sprawling along the shore with its 1,000 tents and palisades, had grown into a city of its own. Fires burned through the night, smoke curling upward like a veil over the masts of the ships. Warriors laughed, feasted, sharpened their blades, and traded boasts about battles past and battles yet to come. Their treasures gleamed, their slaves served them, their armor shone. To an outsider, it might have seemed a place of triumph, for never had so much plunder been heaped together in one place. Yet beneath the surface, pride and resentment smouldered, and in time those flames would erupt more fiercely than any Trojan assault. Among the many captives taken during raids was a young woman named Chrysis, the daughter of Chrysis, a priest of Apollo. She had been given to Agamemnon as a prize, a token of honor, for such was the custom of the Greeks. But when Chrysis came to the camp bearing ransom, offering gold and treasures to free his daughter, Agamemnon spurned him. The High King's pride was swollen, and he scorned the old man's pleas. Chrysis left in sorrow, lifting his hands to the heavens and calling upon Apollo to avenge the insult. The god heard, and his answer was swift. The next dawn, plague fell upon the Greek camp. It crept like a shadow from tent to tent, striking down men and beasts alike. The fires of funeral pyres burned without ceasing, their smoke choking the sea air. The cries of the sick and dying filled the camp, while priests sacrificed in vain to appease the god. Panic spread, and the soldiers murmured against their leaders, asking why they must perish for the arrogance of one man. At last, a council was called. Nestor, his voice heavy with age, urged Agamemnon to relent. Odysseus, with careful words, reminded him that Apollo's wrath could only be calmed by returning the girl to her father. Even Achilles, usually silent in such matters, spoke, urging that the lives of the men mattered more than the pride of a single king. Agamemnon, cornered by necessity, at last agreed to return Chrysis, but his pride was not softened. He stood in the midst of the assembled kings, his face hard with fury. "You strip me of my prize," he thundered, "as though I were some common man among you. If I must lose what is mine, then I shall take from another. Do not think I will sit empty-handed while others boast of their captives. I am High King, and if I must yield, then I shall seize compensation from one of you, Ajax, Odysseus, or even Achilles himself." The words fell like a spear into Achilles' heart. His pride, vast as his strength, could not bear such insult. He rose, his eyes blazing like fire, his hand already straying toward the hilt of his sword. "You dare?" he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You who take no risks, who hang back while better men shed their blood, who claim the lion's share of plunder yet never earn it. You think yourself king over us all, but without us you are nothing. You threaten to take what I have won with my spear? You coward, you dog-faced drunkard of war." End of quote. The council erupted in shouts, men rising from their seats, hands on their weapons. Only the sudden, unseen presence of Athena stayed the hand of Achilles. Invisible to all but him, she seized his hair and whispered in his ear, "Hold your rage. Do not strike him, though your heart longs for it. Words may yet serve your pride. If you lift your hand against him now, you will doom yourself." Achilles, quivering with fury, obeyed the goddess, but his voice still lashed like a whip. "Take what you will, Agamemnon," he said at last, his tone like ice. "Seize my prize, insult me before all, but hear this, I will no longer fight for you. Let the Trojans burn your ships. Let them slaughter your men. When you come crawling to me in your need, you will remember this day. You will see how much you depend upon the arm you have disgraced." Agamemnon sneered, his pride wounded but unbent. And to prove his authority, he acted at once. He sent heralds to Achilles' tent to take Briseis, the maiden given to Achilles as his prize of honor. Achilles watched in silence as they led her away, his hands trembling with the urge to strike them down. but he restrained himself, knowing that violence against heralds, messengers of the gods as well as men would bring ruin. Still, the humiliation burned deeper than any wound. When Briseis was gone, Achilles strode to the shore. He stood apart from the camp, gazing out at the endless sea, his heart a storm of fury and grief. Lifting his hands, he cried out to his mother, Thetis, the silver-footed sea-nymph who had borne him to Peleus. From the depths she rose, shimmering with foam, her face marked with sorrow at her son's anguish. "Mother," Achilles said, his voice breaking, "you bore me for sorrow. Short is my life, you told me, but it was to be filled with glory. And now my honor is torn from me by a man who calls himself king. Swear to me you will plead with Zeus, father of gods and men. Ask him to tilt the scales in favor of the Trojans, to drive the Greeks back to their ships. Let them suffer without me. Let them see how they fare without Achilles." Thetis wept, for she knew the doom that clung to her son, yet she promised to do as he asked. She rose from the sea and ascended to Olympus, where she knelt before Zeus himself. The king of gods frowned, for he knew the strife that would come, but he was bound by the plea of the goddess. At last he nodded, and the fate of the Greeks shifted. In the days that followed, Achilles withdrew entirely from the war. He did not march with the host, did not raise his spear, did not join the councils of the kings. He sat in his tent or upon the shore, his great armour untouched, his wrath smouldering like a firebank beneath ashes. Without him, the Greeks faltered. Hector led the Trojans in bold sorties, driving the enemy back, pressing them toward their ships. Men fell, their cries rising above the clash of bronze, and the camp that had once seemed impregnable began to tremble. Pride had set brother against brother, king against champion. The Greeks had come to Troy united by oath, but now they were divided by insult. And as the Trojans pressed their advantage, as fire licked at the timbers of the Greek ships, all men began to see the truth. Without Achilles, the greatest of them all, their cause might fail. The wrath of Achilles and the death of Patroclus. The quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles left the Greek camp like a body without its heart. The greatest warrior of the age no longer strode into battle, and the Myrmidons, loyal to their commander above all others, kept to their tents, polishing their arms but refusing to fight. The ships lay drawn up on the shore, their hulls black against the sea, and each day the Trojans pressed closer. Hector, tireless and unyielding, led his men with the confidence of a lion driving prey into a corner. The balance of war had shifted, and for the first time, the Greeks feared not merely stalemate but utter destruction. Each dawn, the Trojans surged across the plain, their cries echoing beneath the walls. Each dusk, the Greeks fell back to their fortifications, their shields battered, their ranks thinned. The gods themselves leaned their weight into the struggle. Apollo favoured the Trojans, deflecting Greek spears, filling Hector's heart with fire. Hera and Athena, still loyal to the Greeks, raged at Zeus, who had honoured Thetis's plea, and tilted the scales against them. The plain was a theatre of both mortal valour and divine whim, where men bled and died to satisfy the quarrels of immortals. Within his tent, Achilles brooded. His armour, once blazing in the sun, hung untouched upon its stand. His great spear, which few other men could even lift, leaned against the wall, silent. He sat by the shore, staring across the endless sea, his hands idle, his heart a storm. Patroclus, his dearest friend, tried often to soothe him, speaking of the suffering of their comrades, of the ships that now smoked as Trojan fire licked at their hulls. "Do you not hear their cries?" Patroclus asked. "Do you not see the flames rising? Must the Greeks perish for the sake of your pride?" Achilles turned his face away, his jaw clenched. "They insulted me before all. They stripped me of honour, and without honour a man is nothing. Let Agamemnon taste the price of his arrogance. Let him learn how much he depends upon me." Yet even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed the torment within, for he was not blind to the suffering of his companions, nor deaf to the cries that drifted on the sea wind. The Trojans pressed harder. At last, they breached the palisades and reached the ships themselves. Flames rose, smoke billowing across the camp. The timbers cracking as fire devoured the vessels that had carried the Greeks across the sea. Panic spread, men throwing water upon the flames, others fighting desperately to push back the Trojan tide. And in that moment, Patroclus could bear no more. He came to Achilles, his face pale with urgency, his voice trembling with both fear and determination. "If you will not fight, then let me go in your stead. Lend me your armor, that the Trojans may believe Achilles has returned to the field. Their courage will falter at the sight, and we may drive them back from the ships. I do not ask you to forgive Agamemnon or to set aside your anger. I ask only that you let me stand for you, to save our comrades from ruin." Achilles' eyes softened, for Patroclus was more than a companion. He was a brother in all but blood, bound to him from childhood, sharing in his joys and sorrows alike. "Take my armor," he said at last, "and lead the Myrmidons into battle. The Trojans will think I have returned, and they will flee. But heed me well. Drive them back from the ships, save our fleet, but go no further. Do not pursue them to the walls of Troy, for Hector is favoured by the gods upon his own soil, and you are not destined to stand against him." Patroclus bowed his head, but in his heart burned the fire of youthful glory, the hunger to carve his name into memory. He donned Achilles' gleaming armor, the breastplate that shone like the sun, the greaves with their silver clasps, the great shield, the plumed helmet that caught the light. When he stepped forth, even the Myrmidons gasped, for it seemed their master had returned. With cries of exultation, they poured forth from their tents, their spears raised, their eyes blazing with new courage. The Trojans, seeing the figure they believed to be Achilles striding onto the field, faltered. Panic spread through their ranks. They remembered the terror of his spear, the countless men he had slain, and they turned in fear. Patroclus drove them before him, cutting them down with spear and sword, the Myrmidons at his back. The plain that had echoed with Trojan cries now rang with their flight. Fires at the ships were quenched, and the Greeks rallied behind the false vision of their greatest hero. But Patroclus, flushed with triumph, forgot the warning. His heart swelled with the intoxication of battle, and he pressed onward, chasing the fleeing Trojans across the plain. 3 times he charged the walls of Troy. 3 times he was driven back by Apollo himself, who stood invisible upon the battlements, shielding the city from the doom not yet decreed. Still, Patroclus would not turn back. In his fury he slew Sarpedon, son of Zeus, casting him down in the dust, his blood watering the earth. Zeus himself wept tears of blood at the death of his son, though he allowed fate to unfold. At last, as Patroclus pressed toward the Scaean gate, Apollo struck him from behind, stunning him, knocking his helmet from his head so that his hair streamed free. In that moment of weakness, a Trojan named Euphorbus thrust his spear into Patroclus's back, wounding him. He staggered, his knees buckling, and in that moment Hector closed upon him, his spear piercing Patroclus's belly. The friend of Achilles fell, gasping his last breath upon Trojan soil. As he lay dying, Patroclus spoke, his voice a whisper yet clear. "You think you have killed me, Hector, but it is not you, nor Euphorbus, nor Apollo. It is Achilles you have brought upon yourself. He will come, and you will fall, and soon the earth will drink your blood." With those words, his life fled, and his body lay still. Hector stripped the armor from the fallen man, rejoicing to wear the gleaming panoply of Achilles, though he did not know that in taking it, he had clothed himself in his own doom. The battle raged around the body of Patroclus, Greeks and Trojans clashing desperately for possession of the corpse. At last, through the valor of Ajax and Menelaus, the Greeks bore it back to their camp, weeping as though for a brother. When word reached Achilles, the cry that burst from him shook the camp. He threw himself upon the ground, pouring dust upon his head, tearing his hair, his voice rising in a keening wail that pierced the hearts of all who heard. His grief was boundless, his fury immeasurable. Thetis rose once more from the sea to comfort him, but even she could not soften his wrath. "He was dearer to me than all else," Achilles cried, "and now he is gone. Let me die at once, for I have failed him. Only vengeance remains to me now. Hector shall pay with his life, though I know well that in killing him I seal my own doom." Thetis, weeping for the fate of her son, went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, and begged him to forge new armor, for Hector now bore Achilles his own. The god labored through the night, his forge blazing with fire, his hammer ringing against immortal bronze. By dawn, he had wrought a panoply unmatched in all the world, a shield that bore the images of earth and sky, of cities at peace and at war, of harvest and festival, of all the world's joys and sorrows. When Thetis laid this armor before Achilles, the Myrmidons trembled at its splendor, and Achilles, his grief now hardened into a wrath that nothing could quench, rose at last from his mourning. He stood before the Greek assembly, his voice thunderous, his eyes blazing. "Agamemnon wronged me, and I withdrew. But no insult, no treasure, no pride matters now. Patroclus is dead, and I will not rest until Hector lies slain. I return to the war, not for Agamemnon, not for Greece, but for my friend. And woe to Troy, for I will sweep the plain with fire and blood until I have my vengeance." The camp roared with renewed hope, though some shuddered at the look upon Achilles' face, for it seemed less human than divine, a visage touched by doom. The war was about to change, for the wrath of Achilles had been unleashed, and no man, mortal or immortal, could stand before it unscathed. The return of Achilles and the death of Hector. The dawn that followed the death of Patroclus was heavy with silence, as though the plain itself held its breath. But when Achilles strode from his tent, clad in the new armor forged by Hephaestus, the silence broke into murmurs of awe. The bronze gleamed like fire, the great shield shimmered with the images of the cosmos, and upon his head the plumed helmet blazed as though it bore the sun itself. The Myrmidons rallied around him, their spirits rekindled, for they knew their lord had returned to the field at last. Even the horses of Achilles, immortal offspring of the west wind, trembled as he harnessed them to his chariot. One of them, Xanthus, lifted his head and spoke with a voice not of beasts but of gods. "We will carry you swiftly, Achilles, as we always have. But know this, your death approaches. It was not by our failure that Patroclus fell, nor will it be by our failure that you soon follow him." Achilles did not flinch. He only nodded, his face carved with grim resolve. "I know," he said, "my death is near, but first I will send many Trojans to the house of Hades, and Hector shall not escape me." When he stepped upon the field, the Greeks surged forward as though a tide long held back had at last been released. Their cries shook the plain, their spears gleamed in the sunday. Across the battlefield, the Trojans faltered at the sight, for they thought they had stripped Achilles of his armor and left him powerless. Now he came again, brighter and deadlier than ever, and terror gripped their hearts. The battle was slaughter. Achilles charged like a storm-given form, his spear cutting down men as a scythe cuts wheat. No Trojan could stand before him. Even those who fled found no safety, for he pursued without mercy. The Scamander River ran choked with bodies, and when the waters rose in protest, nearly drowning him in their wrath, Hephaestus himself sent fire to dry the river's fury and save Achilles from death before his destined hour. Gods walked the field, shielding their favorites, striking their foes, but none could halt the firestorm that Achilles had become. At last, the Trojans fled within their walls, their gates groaning shut as men scrambled for safety, all save one. Hector remained outside, standing alone upon the plain. From the walls, Priam, his father, called to him, begging him to return within the safety of Troy. Hecuba, his mother, bared her breast and pleaded that he remember the milk that once fed him, that he not leave her to mourn her son. But Hector stood firm, for his honor would not permit him to seek shelter while his people watched. He had led them into battle, and he would not be the first to hide behind walls. Yet when Achilles drew near, blazing in his divine armor, the courage of Hector faltered. The sight was too much. This was no longer a man, but something more, a fury clothed in bronze, a wrath made flesh. And so Hector turned and ran. 3 times they circled the walls of Troy, Hector fleeing, Achilles pursuing, their feet pounding the dust, their breath burning in their chests. The gods watched from Olympus, some pitying Hector, others urging Achilles on. At last, Athena appeared to Hector in the guise of his brother Deiphobus, urging him to stand. Believing he was no longer alone, Hector turned to face his foe. But when he called upon his brother for aid, he saw only empty air. Realization struck him like a spear. He had been deceived, abandoned to face Achilles alone. The two met before the Scaean gate. Hector cast his spear first, but Athena guided it aside. Achilles hurled his in return, striking the gap in Hector's armor, the very spot left vulnerable. The spear drove through his throat, and Hector fell, gasping for breath, his life pouring into the dust. With his final words, he begged Achilles, "Return my body to my family, that they may give me proper rights, accept ransom, as is the custom of men." But Achilles, his face dark with fury, snarled, "Dog, do not speak to me of ransom. I wish I could carve your flesh and eat it raw for what you have done to Patroclus. No gold, no treasure will buy your body back. The dogs and birds shall feast upon you." With that, he stripped Hector of the armor, his own armor, once stolen from the body of Patroclus, and pierced the corpse's heels. He lashed them with leather thongs to his chariot and dragged the body through the dust. Around the walls of Troy he rode, the corpse of their champion trailing behind him as Priam and Hecuba screamed from the battlements, their voices breaking with grief. For days he repeated this desecration, circling the tomb of Patroclus, his rage unsoftened by the pleas of the Greeks, who shuddered at the excess of his vengeance. The gods themselves grew angered. Zeus, pitying Priam, sent Hermes to guide the old king through the Greek camp under cover of night. In Achilles' tent, Priam fell to his knees and kissed the hands that had slain his son. "Remember your own father," he said, his voice trembling yet steady. "He is old as I am old. He waits for a son who may never return. Pity me, Achilles, for I have endured what no man should. I have kissed the hands that killed my child." At those words, something broke within Achilles. For the first time since Patroclus' death, tears came not only for himself, but for another. He wept with Priam, their grief mingling, their loss shared. At last, he relented. He ordered Hector's body washed, anointed with oils, and returned to the Trojans. He granted them 12 days of peace to bury their dead. And so Hector was borne back to Troy, his body laid upon the pyre, his people mourning the fall of their greatest defender. The flames rose high, carrying his spirit to the realm of shades. The city wept, its hope dimmed, its future darkened. For with Hector gone, Troy stood bereft of the shield that had long guarded it. Achilles, his wrath not quenched but momentarily stilled, stood upon the shore, staring into the endless horizon. He knew his doom was near, for Hector's dying words had named it, and his mother had told him so long ago. Yet he did not waver. He had taken his vengeance, and though his life would be short, his name would live as long as men remembered the war at Troy. The cycle of vengeance had reached its peak, The greatest of Troy's sons had fallen to the wrath of the greatest of the Greeks. But the war was not ended. The city still stood, the gods still quarrelled, and fate had yet to play its final card. The Amazons and Memnon, new allies for Troy. The pyre of Hector had scarcely cooled, its smoke still lingering in the air above Troy, when whispers of new hope began to stir within the city. Though their champion was gone, Troy was not without friends in the wider world, and from distant lands came word of allies who would march to their aid. They were drawn by bonds of kinship, by promises of glory, and by the sheer renown of the war that had already claimed so many heroes. Among them came two figures who shone so brightly in legend that even their deaths would be remembered for centuries. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, and Memnon, son of the dawn. The Amazons were a people set apart, a nation of warrior women said to descend from Ares himself. They lived far to the north and east, in the shadow of rivers and mountains beyond the Black Sea, their lives bound not by the hearth but by the battlefield. Their queen, Penthesilea, had come not only to aid Troy but also to cleanse herself of a personal sorrow. For in a hunt she had struck her sister down by accident, and though no god condemned her, her heart was heavy with grief. War, she believed, would grant her absolution. To die gloriously in battle would be her redemption. When Penthesilea rode into Troy, her armour gleamed with bronze polished bright as a mirror. Her helmet bore the crest of a horse's mane, and her spear was longer than those of most men. With her came a company of Amazon warriors, their hair bound tight, their shields painted with emblems of wolves, owls, and serpents. The people of Troy, gathered in the streets, lifted their voices in awe, for never before had they seen such women figures who seemed half divine, their beauty matched only by their martial bearing. Even in grief, the city felt pride again, believing that fate had sent them a champion. Penthesilea did not linger in ceremony. At dawn, she led her Amazons forth against the Greeks. Their cries echoed across the plain, fierce and shrill, unlike the deeper shouts of men. They fell upon their enemies with a fury that startled even seasoned warriors. Spears flashed, swords rang, and Greek blood stained the earth anew. For a moment, it seemed as though the tide might turn once more, but no mortal could stand forever against Achilles. The son of Peleus strode into the fray, his armour blazing, his spear cutting down all who opposed him. When at last he faced Penthesilea, the plain seemed to pause, every eye fixed upon the meeting of the greatest warrior of Greece and the queen of the Amazons. Their spears clashed, their shields rang, their cries shook the air. Penthesilea fought with the desperation of one who sought redemption in death, and for a moment even Achilles marvelled at her courage. She drove her spear into his shield, the point piercing deeper than any had before, but the shield held. With a final thrust, Achilles struck her through, and she fell, her blood soaking the dust. As she lay dying, he removed her helmet, and when her face was revealed, legend says Achilles was struck with love, or something like it, pity, admiration, sorrow, all mingled together. In that moment, he saw not an enemy but a noble soul undone by fate. Some claim he wept over her body, though others say his grief was mocked by his comrades. A soldier named Thersites jeered, accusing him of weakness, of lust for a fallen foe. Enraged, Achilles struck Thersites down, killing him before the assembled host. The Greeks murmured in shock, for to slay a comrade was a grave offence, even for Achilles. Thus Penthesilea, in death, sowed strife even among her enemies. Yet Troy's hope did not end with her passing. From the far reaches of the east came another ally, Memnon, king of Ethiopia, son of Tithonus and Eos, the goddess of the dawn. Tall and radiant, he arrived clad in armour forged by Hephaestus himself, second only to that of Achilles in splendour. His host marched behind him, dark-skinned warriors from the southern lands, their shields broad, their spears gleaming like reeds of bronze. To the Trojans, weary with grief, he seemed like the morning sun itself, a light breaking after long darkness. Memnon was no ordinary man. He carried in his veins the blood of immortals, and in his heart the pride of kingship. He was said to have matched any hero of his age in strength and skill, and his mother Eos wept each morning for the doom she foresaw in his path. Yet Memnon came willingly, bound by friendship with Priam and the honour owed to a noble city in peril. When he entered Troy, Priam embraced him as a son, and the people cheered until the towers shook. Hector was gone, but Memnon's presence filled the void, if only for a little while. He swore before all that he would stand in Hector's place, that he would guard the gates and drive back the Greeks. And true to his word, he rode forth at dawn, his armour gleaming red gold in the first light of day, his host shouting as one. The clash was terrible. Memnon cut down Antilochus, son of Nestor, who had leapt to save his father from the Ethiopian king's spear. The old man wept as his son fell, his cries echoing across the field. The Greeks raged, and Achilles himself strode forth, for he could not ignore the challenge. The two titans met, the plain trembling beneath their feet, the gods above pausing to watch. For long they fought, their spears shattering, their swords ringing. Each seemed the equal of the other, strength meeting strength, skill meeting skill. Zeus himself weighed their fates upon his golden scales, and at last the scale of Memnon sank. Achilles drove his blade through the Ethiopian king, and Memnon fell, his blood soaking the earth, his breath fleeing into the sky. Eos, his mother, wept tears that fell like dew upon the grass, and she gathered his spirit in her arms, carrying him away in light. The Trojans wept again, for their second hope had perished as swiftly as the first. Achilles stood over Memnon's fallen body, triumphant yet grim, for he knew the pattern of fate was closing in around him. Each enemy he slew brought him closer to his own end, and though his glory grew, so too did the shadow that followed him. The plain of Troy was once more littered with corpses, and the air stank of blood and smoke. The Greeks dragged their dead back to their camp. The Trojans carried theirs within the city walls, and both sides mourned more heroes than they could count. The war had consumed a generation, and still it was not ended, but all men whispered now of one thing: the doom of Achilles. For if Memnon had fallen, if Penthesilea had perished, then surely the greatest of them all could not be far from his own destined hour. The death of Achilles. The plain of Troy lay heavy with silence in the days after Memnon's fall. Smoke rose from funeral pyres, and the cries of mourning mingled with the crash of the sea against the shore. The Greeks, though weary, lifted their heads with pride, for Achilles still strode among them, undefeated, invincible, the slayer of Penthesilea, of Memnon, and of countless warriors whose names had already begun to fade into dust. The Trojans, by contrast, huddled within their walls, their eyes dark with grief, their voices hoarse with lament. Hector was gone, Penthesilea was gone, Memnon was gone, and though their towers still stood, all felt that the shadow of doom hung over them. Yet amid their despair, one figure burned with bitterness. Paris, son of Priam, whose judgment had once given Aphrodite the golden apple and set all these events into motion, still walked the halls of Troy. He was no Hector, no bold defender of the city, and his name was often spoken with scorn. But the gods who had begun this quarrel had not forgotten him, and though his hand lacked the strength of Achilles, fate had marked him as the instrument of destiny. Achilles, knowing his time was short, fought with a fury that was half courage and half resignation. He no longer sought life, but only glory, driving the Trojans back to their gates, cutting down men as a storm fells trees in a forest. His armour blazed in the sun, his voice thundered across the field, and the Trojans whispered that he was less man than God. Yet even as he triumphed, omens gathered around him. Birds of ill omen wheeled overhead. The Scamander River, once nearly his grave, groaned with unease, and his mother's warning echoed always in his mind. If Hector fell by his hand, Achilles would not long survive him. The gods, too, watched closely. Some still favoured the Trojans Apollo, who had long shielded them, and Aphrodite, who had bound Helen to Paris. Hera and Athena still guided the Greeks, yet they knew the fates had already woven the end. Zeus himself weighed the hour, unwilling to intervene against the threads spun by the Moirai. The moment came at the Scaean gate, where once Hector had fallen. Achilles, driving the Trojans before him, approached the very threshold of the city. The archers upon the walls loosed their arrows, but none could pierce his divine armour. He fought like fire against straw, scattering all in his path. Then Apollo, taking pity on the Trojans and burning with anger at the desecration of Hector's body, cloaked Paris in his own divine power. The archer prince, whose courage had often failed him, felt his hands guided, his bow steadied, his eyes sharpened. He drew the string, and Apollo directed the arrow toward the one place on Achilles' body left unguarded the heel, where Thetis had held him when she dipped him in the river Styx. The arrow flew, swift and true, and struck the tendon of Achilles. He staggered, the shock of the wound tearing through him like lightning. For a moment he stood, disbelieving, as though the world itself had betrayed him. Then the strength fled from his limbs, and he fell to the dust of the plain he had stained so often with the blood of others. Even in that moment, he did not go quietly. Lifting his voice, he cursed Paris, calling him coward, calling him puppet of the gods. "It is not you who has slain me," he cried. "It is Apollo, it is fate. You have loosed the shaft, but it was guided by hands greater than yours." His eyes, fierce and unyielding, blazed even as his life fled, and he swore that his name would outlive all others, that the songs of men would remember Achilles long after Troy, and all who fought at her gates were dust. The Greeks, seeing their greatest champion fall, roared with grief and rage. Ajax, mighty as a tower, rushed to his side, shielding his body with his shield, cutting down Trojans who sought to seize the corpse. Odysseus, cunning and swift, rallied men to bear Achilles from the field. The Trojans pressed forward, eager to claim the body as they had claimed Hector's, but the Greeks fought like lions, refusing to yield. The clash was terrible, spears snapping, shields splintering, the ground torn with footprints and blood. At last, through the valour of Ajax and Odysseus, the Greeks carried Achilles back to their camp, his body borne high, his armour gleaming with the light of the forge that had shaped it. In the camp, the Myrmidons wailed like women at a funeral, tearing their hair, striking their breasts, their voices carrying across the sea. They laid their lord upon a bier, and Thetis rose from the waves with her sisters, the Nereids, their voices keening with sorrow. She covered her son's body with fine linens and anointed him with ambrosia to preserve him until the funeral rites could be held. Her tears fell into the sea, and the waves themselves seemed to mourn. The funeral of Achilles was unlike any other. The Greeks gathered wood for a massive pyre, towering high, upon which they laid the body of the greatest warrior of their age. They sacrificed horses, dogs, and captives in his honour, sending them to accompany him into the afterlife. The flames rose, blazing so brightly that even the Trojans saw them from their walls and trembled at the sight. The ashes of Achilles were gathered into a golden urn, mingled with those of Patroclus, so that in death as in life the two would never be parted. In his honour, funeral games were held, contests of speed and strength, of chariot racing, boxing, wrestling, and archery. The kings competed, each seeking to prove his worth before the memory of Achilles. Prizes of gold, armour, and weapons were given, and the songs of bards rang through the camp, praising the deeds of the fallen hero. Yet even amid the celebration of his glory, sorrow lay heavy, For all knew that with Achilles gone, the war had entered its final, most desperate phase. The armor of Achilles, forged by Hephaestus and now stripped from his body, became the source of contention. Both Ajax and Odysseus claimed it, for both had borne his corpse from the field. The contest of words that followed would sow discord among the Greeks, bringing madness and death within their own camp. But that was still to come, for now they mourned the man who had been their spear, their shield, their terror and their pride. Troy, too, watched from its walls, knowing that the doom of Achilles did not mean their salvation, for though their greatest enemy had fallen, the Greeks still numbered in the tens of thousands, and their hatred burned hotter than ever. The gods had seen fit to strike down the mightiest of men, but fate had not yet finished its weaving. The end drew nearer, each thread pulled tighter, until the pattern would at last be revealed. Achilles was dead, but his name was immortal. His wrath had shaken the world, and his death had sealed the fate of Troy. Ajax, Odysseus, and the struggle for Achilles' armor. The death of Achilles shook the Greek host to its very core. The man who had been their firebrand, their storm upon the battlefield, lay now in ashes mingled with those of Patroclus. The funeral pyres had smouldered down to embers, the smoke had drifted into the sea, and still the Greeks could not believe that their champion was gone. His presence had been a shield against despair, and without him, even victory seemed hollow. Yet war does not pause for grief. The armies still clashed, the walls of Troy still loomed, and the Greeks were forced to turn from mourning to the question of who would bear the legacy of the fallen hero. For Achilles had left behind not only his glory but also the divine armor wrought by Hephaestus, the shield that bore the cosmos, the breastplate that gleamed like the sun, the helm crested with fire. To wear that armor was to stand in Achilles' place, to command the reverence of the army and the fear of the Trojans. And so a contest was called to decide who among the Greeks was most worthy to inherit it. Two names rose above all others: Ajax, son of Telamon, and Odysseus, son of Laertes. Ajax was a warrior like no other, a giant of a man, second only to Achilles in might. His shield was vast, a wall of oxhide and bronze, and his courage was unquestioned. It was he who had stood firm when the Trojans pressed the ships, he who had carried the body of Achilles from the field. His claim was clear. By strength, by valour, by loyalty, the armour was his. But Odysseus, though not as mighty of limb, was no less formidable. He was the cleverest of the Greeks, the man whose cunning had saved them time and again, whose words could sway councils, whose stratagems turned despair into triumph. He, too, had fought to recover Achilles' body, and his tongue, sharpened by years of guile, made his case with eloquence. It is not brute strength alone, he argued, that sustains our cause. It is wisdom, cunning, and foresight. Achilles himself knew that strategy was as vital as valour. If his armour is to serve Greece, let it be worn by one who can win not only with the spear but also with the mind. The debate raged through the camp, each man speaking for one champion or the other. Some pointed to Ajax's unyielding courage, his steadfast shield, his loyalty without question. Others praised Odysseus's craft, recalling his embassy to Troy, his raids with Diomedes, his unbroken resolve. The kings sat in judgment, their faces grave, for they knew that whichever way the decision fell, resentment would fester. At last, by secret ballot, or by the persuasion of Agamemnon and Menelaus, so the stories differ, the armour was awarded to Odysseus. The decision shocked many. Ajax stood silent, his face dark, his massive hands trembling at his sides. He had expected the honour as his due, certain as the sunrise, and now it was denied him. The Myrmidons muttered angrily. The soldiers who had fought beside him glared in disbelief. But Odysseus accepted the prize with solemn dignity, though behind his eyes flickered the satisfaction of triumph. That night, bitterness consumed Ajax. His pride, once unshakable, cracked beneath the weight of insult. He had stood as a bulwark for Greece, risked his life countless times, saved the fleet itself, and yet the kings had chosen the man of words over the man of deeds, wrath twisted into madness. Some say Athena clouded his mind, for she often favoured cunning above brute force, and sought to protect Odysseus. In his frenzy, Ajax seized his sword and stormed through the camp, believing he was striking down the leaders who had wronged him. But the goddess veiled his sight, and instead of kings he slew livestock, cattle and sheep, hacking them down in a storm of rage. He imagined himself killing Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Odysseus, while in truth he stood drenched in the blood of animals, his cries echoing like those of a beast. When dawn came, clarity returned. Ajax looked upon the slaughtered herds, upon the blood that stained his hands, and despair seized him. His honour was gone. His sanity mocked him, his glory shattered. Unable to bear the shame, he set the hilt of his sword into the earth and threw himself upon the blade. The ground drank his blood, and with his death, Greece lost a hero as steadfast as any who had fought at Troy. The Greeks mourned, though their grief was tinged with unease, for the war that was meant to unite them had now claimed its greatest warrior and its staunchest shield, not by Trojan hands but by their own divisions. The armour of Achilles, gleaming upon Odysseus, seemed as much a curse as a prize. It had not united the host but torn it further apart, leaving them weaker, more fractured, even as Troy still stood. Yet even in their sorrow, the Greeks could not turn back. The war must go on, and though the walls of Troy seemed unyielding, whispers spread of a prophecy that the city could not fall while it possessed the Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena that guarded its walls. If the Greeks wished to end the war, they would need cunning greater than any before, and none but Odysseus could bring it to pass. The theft of the Palladium and the first sparks of deception, the death of Ajax cast a long shadow over the Greek camp. His body, massive and solemn even in death, lay upon a pyre that smoked heavily against the sea wind. The warriors mourned him, not only for his valour but for the bitter truth his end revealed. Their war was eating its own sons, as surely as it devoured the Trojans. Achilles was gone, Ajax was gone, and though Odysseus now bore the shining armour of Hephaestus, few felt reassured. For every victory seemed poisoned by loss, every triumph weighed down with sorrow. It was in this gloom that whispers of prophecy returned to the Greek leaders. For years, the seers had spoken of Troy's divine protectors, but now their voices sharpened. Calchas, the seer whose visions had guided the Greeks since AULIS, declared that the city could not fall so long as the Palladium remained within its walls. This was no ordinary image, but a sacred statue of Athena herself, said to have fallen from the heavens. As long as it stood in Troy, the goddess's protection wrapped the city like a shield. To take it was to strip the Trojans of their last divine safeguard. The Greeks gathered in council, their faces lit by torchlight, their hearts heavy. Many shrank from the thought, for to steal from Athena's temple seemed impiety of the gravest kind. But Odysseus, always clear-eyed, spoke with quiet certainty. "We have bled for 10 years at these walls. Our champions lie in the earth, and still the city stands. If fate demands we take the Palladium, then so we must, or we shall never see our homes again." Diomedes, brave and ruthless, rose beside him. "I will go with you," he said simply. And so it was decided. One moonless night, the two men set forth, cloaked in silence, their sandals soft upon the earth. They crossed the plain, where the bones of countless warriors lay buried beneath the dust, and came at last to the towering walls of Troy. By guile and skill, they found their way within, some say through a hidden passage once known to Antenor, the Trojan elder, who had long urged peace with the Greeks. Others claim Odysseus scaled the wall with rope and iron claws, his movements swift as a thief in the night. However it was done, they entered unseen, shadows moving through the sleeping city. The streets of Troy, so often filled with the cries of merchants and the laughter of children, lay silent beneath the starlight. The towers loomed overhead, the gates barred, the temples heavy with incense. The two Greeks moved like phantoms, their eyes fixed upon the citadel where Athena's temple stood. Within, the Palladium gleamed in the faint light of oil lamps, a small, ancient figure, carved of wood, yet heavy with a presence that seemed to watch them. Its eyes, unblinking and stern, glared from the shadows, and for a moment both men hesitated. To lay hands upon it was to invite the wrath of the goddess herself. But Diomedes, whose courage never faltered, stepped forward. He lifted the statue in his arms, its weight greater than its size should allow, as though the spirit of the goddess resisted. Odysseus kept watch, his dagger drawn, every sense alert. The air thickened, the flames of the lamps flickered, and some say the earth itself trembled. Yet no alarm was raised, and the two carried their prize back through the darkness, retracing their path, until the cool night air of the plain once more surrounded them. When they returned to the camp with the Palladium, the Greeks rejoiced. The symbol of Troy's protection was theirs, and with it the certainty that the city's fall was now possible. But mingled with their joy was unease, for they had touched the sacred, violated the temple of a goddess, and all knew that such deeds do not pass without cost. Odysseus bore the weight with calm, but Diomedes, though fearless in battle, felt the shadow of guilt creep upon him. In Troy, when the theft was discovered, despair spread like wildfire. The priests wailed, the people cried out, and even the bravest warriors felt their hearts sink. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, lifted her voice once more, crying that the end was near, that the city's last protection had been torn away. Yet, as always, no one believed her. They called her mad, cursed by Apollo, though her visions burned with truth. From that night forward, the Greeks no longer sought victory by strength of arms alone. Odysseus's cunning became the beacon by which they steered. The war had already shown that neither side could break the other by force. Now deception, not battle, would become the weapon that decided the fate of Troy. And so the seeds were planted for the greatest stratagem in history, a trick so bold that it would be remembered for all ages. The theft of the Palladium was the first spark, the proof that guile could succeed where brute strength had failed. Soon that spark would blaze into fire, into the form of a wooden horse that would roll upon the plain, and into the annals of legend. But for now, the Greeks returned to their camp, the statue hidden among them, their eyes glinting with a new kind of hope. For the first time in years, they believed the end was near. The Trojans, by contrast, shivered within their walls, their gods silent, their champions gone, their fate bound ever tighter by the threads the fates spun upon their looms. The Trojan Horse. The plan takes shape. The Greeks had fought for 10 long years upon the plains of Troy, their victories bitter, their defeats heavier still. They had slain Hector, Penthesilea, and Memnon, and even Achilles himself had gone down into the dust. Yet despite all this blood, despite the theft of the Palladium, Troy still stood, her gates unbroken, her towers proud, her people defiant. The Greeks had come with 1,000 ships, but now their numbers were thinned, their spirits worn, and still the walls mocked them. It was then that Odysseus, ever the master of cunning, conceived the plan that would end the war not with spears upon the field, but with deception woven like a snare around Troy's own pride. He stood before the gathered kings in Agamemnon's tent, the sea wind rattling the canvas, the torches sputtering in the night air. His eyes were keen, his voice low but filled with conviction. "We cannot take Troy by force," he said. 10 years have shown us this. Her walls are the work of gods, her gates unyielding, but the heart of man is more fragile than stone. If we cannot break their walls, let us break their will. Let us make the Trojans themselves bring us inside. The kings murmured, some scoffing, others listening. Menelaus, weary of longing for Helen, asked bitterly, "And how shall this be done, when they bar their gates and spit upon us from their towers?" Odysseus's lips curved into a smile that seemed to hold both cruelty and brilliance, with a gift so grand they cannot refuse it, so strange they cannot ignore it. A wooden horse, vast and hollow, built as an offering to Athena. We will leave it upon the plain, as though in honour of the goddess, and we will fain retreat, sailing away with our fleet hidden beyond the horizon. The Trojans, seeing the horse, will believe we have abandoned the war, weary and defeated. They will drag it within their walls, rejoicing at their victory, blind to the danger within. For inside the horse we shall hide our strongest warriors. When night falls they will emerge, open the gates, and Troy shall burn. Oh, the tent fell silent, each man considering the audacity of the plan. Diomedes' eyes gleamed with admiration, for though his heart longed for the clash of arms, he saw the wisdom in the trick. Nestor stroked his white beard and nodded slowly, saying, "It is bold, and it may be the only way. The gods favour cunning as much as courage." Yet others hesitated. Some feared the wrath of Athena for misusing her name. Others doubted that so simple a ruse could deceive the wary Trojans. But in the end, desperation swayed them. 10 years had passed, and their lives, their homes, their very youth had been consumed by the war. If guile could succeed where valour had failed, then so be it. And so the Greeks set to work. Upon the shore they felled great pines from the forests of Mount Ida, their axes ringing through the night. They shaped beams and planks, their hammers echoing across the camp. Slowly the frame of the horse rose, massive and looming, its head rearing high, its flanks broad, its hollow belly large enough to hold a company of men. Wheels were set beneath its hooves, that it might be dragged across the plain. Carvers shaped its features with care, giving it the proud neck and flaring nostrils of a living steed, a figure both wondrous and strange. As it took form, whispers ran through the camp. Some felt awe, as though beholding a thing born of both mortal craft and divine inspiration. Others muttered uneasily, wondering if they toyed too closely with the sacred. But Odysseus moved among them, steadying their resolve, reminding them that only this could bring an end to their endless toil. When at last the horse was complete, it towered above men, gleaming with polished wood, a marvel and a terror. Into its belly crept the chosen warriors, Odysseus himself, Diomedes, Menelaus, Ajax the Lesser, Neoptolemus the son of Achilles, and others whose names would be sung in both praise and lament. They climbed into the hollow, carrying swords and daggers, their faces grim. Within the darkness they crouched, their hearts pounding, knowing that once sealed inside they would entrust themselves to both fate and enemy hands. The rest of the Greeks made ready their deceit. The campfires were doused, the tents struck, the ships dragged once more into the sea, but not all would depart. One man was chosen to remain, to sell the story to the Trojans with lies sweet enough to taste like truth. His name was Sinon. He was a kinsman of Odysseus, clever of tongue and resolute of spirit, chosen precisely because he could weave a tale convincing enough to fool even wary hearts. His body was scourged, his hands bound, so that he might appear as one abandoned, punished by the Greeks. As the sun rose, the Trojans, gazing from their walls, saw a sight that filled them with wonder. The Greek camp lay empty, the ships gone from the shore, and upon the plain stood the colossal horse, gleaming in the light. Men poured from the gates, their voices rising with disbelief and joy. Could it be? After 10 years, had the enemy truly departed? Had the gods at last favoured Troy? They swarmed about the horse, marvelling at its size, its craftsmanship, its strange presence upon the plain. Some urged to drag it into the city as a trophy of victory, a gift to Athena herself. Others counselled caution, whispering of trickery, of hidden snares. Laocoon, the priest of Poseidon, raised his voice above the clamour. "Beware, Trojans," he cried. "Do not trust the Greeks, not even in their gifts. This horse may be filled with warriors, or perhaps it is a machine to break our walls. Burn it. Burn it where it stands, lest it bring ruin upon us." But the people hesitated, torn between awe and fear, pride and prudence. And as they debated, Sinon was brought before them, bound and beaten, his eyes wide with feigned terror. He lifted his voice, and the tale he spun would seal Troy's fate. Sinon's deception and the fall of Laocoon. The gates of Troy had not opened so wide in many years. For a decade the city had endured siege, her people huddled behind stone walls as war raged endlessly upon the plain. Now, in the first dawn that did not carry the cries of Greek battle horns, the Trojans poured forth in astonishment. Where once the black hulls of 1,000 ships had lined the shore, there was only empty water. Where the sprawling camp of their enemies had stretched for miles, there lay nothing but ash pits, footprints, and the charred remains of long-abandoned fires. And in the centre of that empty plain stood a marvel so strange that even the oldest among them could not recall its like a horse, taller than the highest tower, its body hewn from pine and cedar, polished until it gleamed in the sunday. The people swarmed around it, priests and princes, women and children, their voices rising in awe and disbelief. Fingers traced the grain of the timber, eyes craned upward to see the proud head lifted toward the sky. Its hooves rested upon 4 great wheels, so that it might be drawn like a cart. It was a gift, many said, a trophy left by the Greeks in recognition of their failure, an offering to Athena to turn her wrath aside after years of fruitless war. Some laughed with joy, some wept in relief, and some only stared, unable to believe that the long nightmare might truly have ended. Yet amid this swell of hope stood voices of caution. "What trick is this?" asked Antenor, the wise counsellor who had long urged peace. "Do the Greeks, who have burned our fields and butchered our sons, depart so suddenly, and leave behind this monument? I fear their guile more than their swords." Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, strode forward with fire in his eyes, his hands, still scarred from countless sacrifices at the altars, lifted toward the towering horse. "Trojans, beware," he shouted. "Do not trust the Greeks, not even in their gifts. This horse is a ruse, a snare. Either it hides armed men within, or it is built to overtop our walls. Burn it now, before its shadow brings death upon us." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some nodded, their joy tempered by the priest's words. Others jeered, weary of fear, eager to believe that fate had finally turned in their favour. While they quarrelled, a shout rose from the rear. Soldiers dragged forward a figure bound in chains, his body bruised, his face streaked with blood and dust. He stumbled as they forced him before Priam's chariot, and all around voices cried out, "A Greek, one of the enemy left behind." The man fell to his knees in the dust, trembling as though in terror. His name was Sinon, though the Trojans did not yet know it. He lifted his shackled hands, his eyes wide with the look of a hunted animal. "Kill me if you must," he cried, his voice hoarse, "for I no longer care. The Greeks have already cast me aside. I am nothing to them now, abandoned, condemned. Slay me here, and it will be a mercy." Priam leaned forward from his chariot, his old eyes narrowed. "Speak," he commanded. "Who are you, and why have you been left here when your countrymen have fled?" Sinon bowed his head, letting silence linger until pity stirred among the crowd. Then he spoke, his words carefully chosen, his voice breaking at times as though with grief. "I am no one of note, O king, merely a soldier among many. But Odysseus hated me, for I once opposed him in council. He vowed my ruin, and he has made good on his vow. When the Greeks resolved to return home, they feared the wrath of Athena, for you know how they profaned her temple when they stole her palladium, Calchas, their seer, declared that a sacrifice must be made to appease her anger, one of their own must bleed. Odysseus named me, and they agreed. Bound and prepared for slaughter, I awaited death, but in the night, by fortune or by the goddess's will, I slipped my bonds. I fled, and when they sailed, they left me behind. I am nothing now, cast off by my own, a victim of their cruelty. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pity stirred in many hearts, for the tale was bitter and cruel, and all men despise betrayal by one's own kin. Priam gestured, and the guards cut the ropes from his wrists. "You are free now," the king said. "No Trojan shall harm you. But tell me truly, what of this horse? Why did the Greeks build such a thing? And why leave it here upon our plain?" Sinon lowered his gaze, as though reluctant to answer. Then, with a sigh heavy with feigned honesty, he spoke. "It is a gift to Athena, O king. The Greeks built it vast, so that you could not bring it within your walls, for they feared that if Troy housed the goddess's offering, her favour would turn from them to you, and your city would become unconquerable. They left it here to honour her, to appease her, to cleanse the stain of their long offence." The Trojans gasped, their faces alight with pride. To possess such a gift, to claim the goddess's favour, it was a thought almost too glorious to imagine. But still Laocoon's voice rang above the rest, harsh and unyielding. "Fools!" he thundered. "Do not be deceived. This man is a liar, his tongue as false as Odysseus's own. Did you not hear the sound when I struck the horse with my spear? It is hollow, there are men within. Burn it, I say. Burn it to the ground and scatter its ashes to the sea." As if in answer to his fury, the heavens themselves delivered a sign, but not the one he had hoped for. From the sea beyond the walls, where the surf broke white against the shore, there rose two serpents, vast as ships, their coils writhing, their jaws dripping venom. The crowd screamed as the monsters surged across the sand, their eyes blazing red, their scales glistening in the sunday. Laocoon seized a spear, shouting for his sons to run, but the serpents fell upon them with terrible speed. Before the eyes of all Troy, the coils wrapped around the priest and his children, crushing bone and flesh. The boys cried out to their father, their thin voices lost in the thunder of the beasts. Laocoon himself roared defiance, struggling with all his strength, but even he could not resist their grip. The snakes squeezed until his chest burst, until his sons' cries were silenced. Then, their work done, they slithered away to Athena's temple, coiling themselves at the feet of her statue, their tongues flickering like flames. A hush fell upon the crowd. The people trembled, not with suspicion now, but with awe. "It is a sign," they whispered. Laocoon struck the goddess's gift, and the gods themselves destroyed him. To doubt the horse's impiety, to reject it, is death. Even Priam, his face pale, lifted his arms and declared, "Athena has spoken. Bring the horse into the city, and let it stand as a monument to our triumph. Tonight we shall rejoice, for the long war is ended." Only Cassandra, Priam's daughter, cried out in despair. Her eyes burned with the fire of prophecy, her voice cracked with grief. "No, it is death you bring into our walls, fire and blood. I see the flames rising, the towers falling, the streets running red. Believe me, O my people, believe me for once." But the curse of Apollo bound her tongue. The Trojans only shook their heads, pitying her madness, and turned away. Ropes were fastened to the horse. Men strained with all their strength, women and children cheering them on. Slowly, with groaning wheels, the great structure rolled across the plain toward the gates. And when it proved too large to pass through, they themselves tore down part of their wall, the wall that had stood for centuries, the wall built by the hands of gods to make way for the gift that would undo them. With songs and hymns, with garlands and incense, they dragged it into the heart of their city and set it before the temple of Athena. Night fell. The torches burned low, the wine flowed freely, and for the first time in 10 years Troy surrendered itself to joy. Music filled the streets, dancers whirled, and the tired people of the city, drunk on hope and wine, at last let their guard fall. One by one the fires dimmed, the songs faded, the laughter ebbed away into silence, and above them all, the wooden horse loomed in the moonlight, vast and still, its hollow belly filled with armed men crouching in darkness, waiting for the moment when fate would give the signal. The night of fire, the sack of Troy. Night settled over Troy with a gentleness the city had not known in 10 years. The streets glowed with torchlight, and the air was thick with incense and laughter. For the first time in a generation, the Trojans allowed themselves to believe the war was truly over. The Greeks had gone, their camp abandoned, their ships vanished over the horizon. The wooden horse stood proudly in the heart of the city, garlanded with flowers, hailed as a sacred gift to Athena. Songs rose from the houses, and wine flowed freely from amphorae, uncorked after long years of rationing. Children ran laughing through the streets, clutching ribbons and blossoms. Old men wept openly, their wrinkled hands lifted toward the sky in gratitude that they had lived to see Troy safe once more. Maidens danced in circles, their hair shining in the lamplight. Mothers pressed their infants to their breasts, whispering that no more would they hear the thunder of Greek feet at the gates. Even soldiers, weary with endless watch, cast aside their shields and helmets, raising cups of wine instead of spears. The city exhaled, as if waking from a long and terrible dream. Yet high above, the gods watched with different eyes. Hera and Athena, still smouldering with anger at Paris's judgment, smiled coldly. Aphrodite, who had begun it all with her promise, shielded her gaze in sorrow, though she did not intervene. Apollo remained silent, his bow unstrung, for even he knew that fate was already woven too tightly to be undone. Zeus sat upon Olympus and turned his face away, for the ruin of Troy was no longer a question but a certainty. In the deep heart of the wooden horse, shadows shifted. Dozens of Greek warriors crouched within its hollow belly, their bodies slick with sweat, their hands tightening on sword hilts. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of pitch and wood. They had endured hours of silence, listening to the muffled roar of Trojan celebration outside, the beat of drums, the laughter of revelers. Odysseus, ever patient, crouched near the hidden hatch, his ear pressed to the wood. He whispered to the others in the dark, bidding them wait. The time had not yet come. To strike too early would be ruin. To strike too late, disaster. They must wait until Troy slept, until the last torch guttered, until the city lay helpless in slumber. At last, deep into the night, silence crept over the city. The songs dwindled, the laughter ebbed, and one by one the torches burned low. Drunken soldiers slumped against the walls, cups spilling from their hands. Dancers lay asleep where they had fallen, children curled beside their parents. The streets that had roared with joy only hours before now lay still, lit only by the pale light of the moon. Then, at a signal agreed upon, Odysseus lifted the trapdoor. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of smoke and wine. One by one, the warriors descended by rope, their feet landing softly upon the stones. Odysseus was first, followed by Diomedes, then Menelaus, then Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, eager to prove himself worthy of his father's name. Their faces were hard, their eyes glinting with firelight. They moved like wraiths through the silent streets, spreading out toward their appointed tasks. Sinon, who had remained outside, crept through the darkness to the city gates. The guards, heavy with wine, slept, slumped against the posts. With swift strokes, he cut their throats, and the blood pooled black beneath the moon. Then he raised a torch, a flame that flared like a beacon against the night sky. Far out at sea, hidden behind the island of Tenedos, the Greek fleet stirred. The sails that had seemed to vanish days before now rose once more, black triangles upon the silver horizon. Rowers bent to their oars, the sea foamed white beneath the prows, and the 1,000 ships surged forward like wolves returning to the fold. Within the city, the Greeks moved with silent fury. Neoptolemus led his band toward the royal palace, his heart burning with vengeance for his father. Odysseus and Diomedes made for the gates, cutting down any who stirred, swinging them wide for the returning host. Menelaus stalked toward the chambers where Helen lay, his mind torn between wrath and longing. Everywhere the Greeks crept, striking down sentries, spilling blood upon the cobblestones, preparing the city for its doom. Then the gates groaned open, and the waiting army poured in, the streets filled with the tramp of armoured feet, the gleam of bronze, the clash of steel. Torches were flung upon the houses, and flames leapt high into the night. In moments the city was a storm of fire and slaughter. Children cried out, women shrieked, men stumbled from their beds only to fall upon Greek blades. Roof beams cracked and toppled, sparks showering down upon the helpless. The night of joy had become a night of terror. King Priam, roused from his bed by the roar of battle, donned his armour for the first time in years. His wife, Hecuba, clung to his arm, begging him to seek sanctuary. But the old king would not hide while his city burned. He grasped his sword, though his hands trembled with age, and made his way to the altar of Zeus within the palace, where he prayed for his people even as the din of slaughter drew closer. Neoptolemus burst into the palace like a storm. His sword flashed red in the torchlight, his young face contorted with rage. He cut down the guards, he cut down the servants, until he stood before Priam himself. The old king raised his sword, but Neoptolemus struck it aside with contempt. Priam fled to the altar, clinging to the sacred statue, begging for mercy in the name of the gods. But Neoptolemus showed none. He drove his blade into the old man's chest, spilling his blood upon the stones of the altar. The cry of Priam's death echoed through the palace, a sound that seemed to mark the final heartbeat of Troy itself. Elsewhere, horror piled upon horror. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, fled to Athena's temple and clung to the statue of the goddess, seeking sanctuary. But Ajax the Lesser tore her from the altar, defiling her in the sacred space, deaf to her screams, blind to the goddess's wrath. Hecuba, seeing her daughter dragged away, raised her hands in despair, her cries piercing even above the roar of fire. Andromache, widow of Hector, was seized with her young son Astyanax, the last heir of Troy's royal line. The child's eyes were wide with terror as Greek soldiers dragged him to the walls. "No son of Hector shall live to avenge him," they cried, and with pitiless hands they hurled the boy from the tower. His body fell like a broken doll, his mother's screams splitting the night. Helen, cause of it all, sat silent in her chamber, her face pale in the firelight. Some say she wept, others that she laughed bitterly, knowing that no fate could spare her blame. Menelaus burst into the room, his sword raised, his eyes blazing. For a moment he faltered, seeing her beauty unchanged, her face glowing even in the glow of ruin. His arm trembled, the blade wavered, and though he had sworn vengeance, he could not strike. He seized her by the wrist instead, declaring that she would return to Sparta and face whatever judgment awaited her there. Whether he spared her from love or weakness or the will of the gods, no man can say. By dawn, Troy was no more. Her towers crumbled, her palaces gutted, her temples defiled. Flames leapt skyward, black smoke blotting out the morning Sunday. The cries of the dying filled the air, mingling with the clash of steel and the crack of falling timbers. The Greeks dragged captives to the shore, women destined for slavery, children orphaned, priests butchered at their altars. The city that had stood for centuries, that had defied a decade of siege, now lay broken and burning, and above it all, the wooden horse stood, its purpose fulfilled, its belly emptied of doom. It loomed like a mocking god, a monument not of piety but of cunning, a reminder that it was not strength of arms but the guile of men that had toppled Troy, the aftermath, and the curse of return. When dawn at last broke over the smoking plain, the city of Troy was no more. The walls that had once seemed eternal now gaped with breaches. The towers leaned like broken teeth. The palaces were blackened husks. The scent of charred wood mingled with the stench of blood and burned flesh, carried on a wind that blew across the still waters of the Scamander. Survivors, few and trembling, huddled in the ruins, their cries thin and hopeless. The Greeks, drunk on victory and plunder, gathered their spoils on the shore. The war that had consumed a generation had ended, but peace was not the prize that awaited them. Captives were herded like cattle toward the waiting ships. Among them were the noblest women of Troy, their garments torn, their faces streaked with ash and tears. Hecuba, once queen of the wealthiest city in Asia, stumbled barefoot across the stones, her white hair matted with soot. Her cries echoed over the harbour as she watched her children dead, her grandchildren murdered, her city reduced to ashes. Andromache, widow of Hector, walked in silence, her eyes hollow, her arms empty where once her son Astyanax had clung. Cassandra, her prophetic eyes blazing with madness and grief, was dragged toward Agamemnon's ship, claimed as his prize. She screamed of doom yet to come, of blood upon the king's hearth, of a queen's vengeance waiting in Mycenae. The Greeks laughed, dismissing her as mad, blind to the truth of her words. Helen walked among them as well, not as a captive bound, but as one reclaimed. Her beauty, untouched by smoke or grief, shone even in that desolation. Menelaus, sword still in hand, led her toward the ships. His face was a storm of anger and longing, hatred and desire. He had sworn to kill her, to strike her down as the cause of all this ruin. But when the moment came, his hand faltered. Some say her beauty disarmed him, others that Aphrodite shielded her once again. Whatever the reason, Helen lived, and the Greeks accepted her as the prize returned, though none could agree whether she was victim or betrayer, goddess or curse. The Greeks loaded their ships with plunder, gold and silver, bronze and ivory, slaves and cattle. They raised the sails with voices hoarse from 10 years of war, eager to return to their homelands. Yet not all were eager. Nestor, oldest of the kings, counselled caution. We have shed blood in the temples. We have broken the sanctuaries of gods. Do you think the heavens will forget? Do you think Athena will forgive? But his words were drowned in the roar of victory. The kings longed for home, and their men longed for rest. The omens, however, were dark. On the very night Troy fell, Ajax the Lesser defiled Athena's temple by seizing Cassandra from her altar. The goddess, outraged by this sacrilege, turned her eyes against the Greeks. Already the sea brooded with storms, the winds restless, the skies heavy with threat. Calchas the seer shook his head, warning that their journey home would be long and cursed. But the Greeks, blinded by triumph, cared little. Agamemnon, high king of Mycenae, prepared to return with Cassandra beside him. Yet in the shadows of memory, his wife Clytemnestra still burned with hatred. He had sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia at AULIS to win favourable winds, and though he told himself it was for Greece, Clytemnestra had not forgotten. Even now she sharpened her anger like a blade, waiting to greet him not with love but with murder. Menelaus would carry Helen back to Sparta, but peace would not follow him either. The halls of Sparta whispered with betrayal, and the shadow of Paris lingered over their marriage. Odysseus, who had conceived the stratagem of the horse, would set sail for Ithaca, but the gods were not finished with him. 10 years he had spent at Troy, and 10 more would he wander before he saw his homeland again. Diomedes too would find no welcome in Argos, for his wife had taken another to her bed, and his exile would scatter him across foreign lands. Even the sea itself rose in fury against them. As the Greeks launched their ships, the sky darkened. Thunder rolled, and lightning split the clouds. The winds shifted wildly, and waves rose high as mountains. Some ships were dashed upon the rocks, others scattered to distant shores. Ajax the Lesser, who had mocked Athena even as he left her temple, clung to a rock when his ship was torn apart. He lifted his voice in pride, crying that the sea itself could not destroy him. But Athena struck, and Poseidon raised his trident, splitting the rock beneath him. The waves swallowed Ajax whole, dragging him to a nameless grave. Menelaus was cast far off course, wandering for years among strange lands, before at last returning with Helen. Agamemnon reached Mycenae, but only to find betrayal at his hearth, where Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus waited with sharpened blades. Nestor alone returned safely, his wisdom sparing him the wrath of the gods. And Odysseus, his fate was the most bitter of all. 10 more years would he wander, through storms and shipwreck, through the halls of Circe and Calypso, through the caverns of Polyphemus and the straits of Scylla and Charybdis. When at last he returned to Ithaca, it would be in rags, his halls filled with suitors for his wife. Thus the victors of Troy found their triumph poisoned. They had toppled a city, but the gods exacted their price. Pride had blinded them, cruelty had stained them, and the sea itself became their enemy. The war had begun with a wedding feast and a golden apple. It ended with fire and ruin, with widows and orphans, with heroes scattered like leaves upon the winds. Troy's ruins smouldered, its people enslaved, its memory carved into the songs of bards. The Greeks carried their spoils, but none carried peace, for the curse of the gods followed them across the wine-dark sea, and their return would prove as tragic as the war itself. Legacy of Troy, myth, memory, and immortality. The smoke of Troy rose for days, a dark column marking the end of an age. In the ashes of its palaces, amid the shattered stones of its temples, men and women whispered of what had been lost and what could never be regained. The Greeks had departed, their ships scattered by storm and fate, but the ruin they left behind endured. For the fall of Troy was not merely the end of a city, it was the closing of a chapter in the story of humankind, a moment when myth and history intertwined so tightly that neither could ever again be separated. For centuries afterward, travellers crossing the plains of Ilium would find the ground still littered with broken spearheads, shards of pottery, fragments of bone. Shepherds told their children that the earth there never ceased to bleed, for so much blood had been spilled upon it. Poets, wandering from court to court, carried the tale in their songs: the wrath of Achilles, the death of Hector, the cunning of Odysseus, the beauty of Helen, the fall of proud Priam and his house. Around fires and in marketplaces, the story lived, reshaped and retold, a tapestry woven again and again until it seemed less a memory than a truth written into the bones of the world. In Greece, the war became both a warning and a source of pride. Kings traced their lineages back to heroes who had fought at Troy, claiming the blood of Agamemnon or Diomedes, Ajax or Odysseus. Cities celebrated their part in the great conflict, raising temples and commissioning statues of the warriors whose names had become immortal. But they also remembered the cost: the daughters sacrificed, the wives betrayed, the long years lost, the wrath of the gods unappeased. Troy's ashes were a mirror in which Greece saw both its glory and its folly. For the Trojans, the story was different, but it endured no less strongly. Survivors carried their grief into exile, some settling in distant lands, others wandering with nothing but memory. Among them was Aeneas, son of Anchises, who bore upon his shoulders both his aged father and the sacred fire of his city. Guided by omens, he fled the burning gates with a band of followers. His journey, sung later by Roman poets, carried him across the seas to Italy, where his descendants would rise to found an empire greater than any that had come before. Thus, in the ashes of Troy, Rome would one day find its seed. The gods themselves faded with time, their altars broken, their names whispered only in old stories. Yet their actions in the war, their quarrels and caprices, lived on in the minds of mortals. The judgment of Paris, the wrath of Athena, the vengeance of Hera, the pity of Aphrodite, these tales spoke not only of divine whim but of human truth. For the gods in the story were mirrors of men, jealous, proud, loving, cruel. In their hands, mortals had been pawns, but in the telling, mortals gave them form and voice, shaping them into symbols of forces that still move through human hearts. And what of Helen? Her name became a riddle, a symbol of beauty so great it could move kings to war and gods to strife. Was she guilty, or was she a victim of fate? Did she go with Paris willingly, or was she compelled by Aphrodite's power? Each poet gave a different answer. Each generation argued anew, but all agreed that no mortal woman had ever shaped history as she had, whether by choice or by curse. Her face, as the poets said, launched 1,000 ships, and with them 1,000 sorrows. Achilles, too, lived on in song, the greatest of warriors, the man who chose short-lived glory over long life. His wrath, his grief for Patroclus, his duel with Hector, his death by the arrow of Paris, all these became the heart of Homer's Iliad, the song that would echo through millennia. In his tale, men saw both the brilliance and the doom of heroism, the price paid for fame eternal. Hector, his noble foe, stood as a counterpoint, a man who fought not for glory but for his city, his wife, his son. The two heroes, bound in death, came to represent two visions of human worth, the fleeting blaze of renown and the enduring love of home. As centuries turned to millennia, scholars asked, was Troy real? Did such a city truly stand upon the western shores of Asia Minor, its towers bright against the morning sun? For long ages, the story was thought myth alone, a tapestry of invention spun by poets. Yet, in the 19th century, a man named Heinrich Schliemann turned spade to earth in the hills of Hisarlik in modern Turkey. There he found layers upon layers of ancient ruins, cities built atop cities, each destroyed and rebuilt across the ages. Among them, one bore the marks of violent fire and sudden destruction, dating to the 13th century BCE, an echo of the time when the Trojan War is said to have occurred. Was it Troy? Did the stones whisper of Priam and Hector, of Paris and Cassandra? No one could say for certain, yet the discovery breathed life into the old songs, reminding the world that myth and history are not so far apart. Beneath every legend lies a kernel of truth, a memory of real people, real struggles, real flames that once consumed real walls. Perhaps the war was not as Homer sang it. Perhaps the gods never walked the plain, and Achilles was not invulnerable save for his heel. But perhaps a city did burn, and men did fight, and the memory of that struggle grew in the telling until it became the greatest story of the West. Today, the ruins of Hisarlik still stand, stones crumbling under the sun, grass growing over the ancient walls. Tourists walk where once warriors fought, their voices hushed, their footsteps soft upon the dust. The wind whispers across the plain, carrying with it echoes of bronze on bronze, of chariots rumbling, of cries of victory and of grief. And in the silence of evening, when the shadows stretch long, it is easy to believe that the ghosts of Troy still linger, watching as the living remember them. The Trojan War was never only about a woman, nor a city, nor even the pride of kings. It was about the timeless struggles of humanity, love and betrayal, pride and folly, fate and free will. It was about the price of honor, the lure of glory, the weight of vengeance. It was about how easily the actions of a few Paris choosing Aphrodite Menelaus demanding his oath, Agamemnon seizing a prize can draw nations into ruin. It was, in short, about us. And so the story endures. From Homer's Iliad to Virgil's Aeneid, from the tragedies of Euripides to the songs sung by medieval bards, from Renaissance paintings to modern films, the fall of Troy is told and retold. Each age finds in it what it needs: a warning, an inspiration, a reflection of its own struggles. The walls of Troy may lie in ruins, but in story, they will never fall. The war began with a wedding feast, with laughter and song, with gods seated beside mortals. It ended with fire and ash, with temples desecrated and kings cut down at their own altars. But in that arc, from joy to ruin, from pride to despair, lies the essence of human history. For we too rise and fall, build and destroy, love and grieve. Troy is gone, yet Troy is eternal, living on wherever men and women gather to tell stories of love and loss, of valor and vengeance, of hope and its undoing. And if you stand upon the plain at dusk, when the cicadas fall silent and the stars appear, you may still hear it, the echo of bronze shields clashing, the murmur of distant voices, the whisper of Helen's name carried on the wind. For Troy, though fallen, lives forever in memory, in myth, and in the restless hearts of those who seek to understand what it means to be human. For Troy, though fallen, lives forever in memory, in myth, and in the restless hearts of those who seek to understand what it means to be human. And so our long journey comes to its end. We have walked through wedding halls bright with laughter, across battlefields ringing with bronze, through the smoke of Troy's burning towers, and into the quiet ruins where only memory remains. These stories, carried for 3,000 years, remind us not only of the deeds of heroes, but of the fragility of all human things. As the echoes fade, let your own breathing steady, your mind drift free of battle cries and God's quarrels, until only the rhythm of the present moment remains. The walls of Troy have fallen, the heroes have gone to their rest, and so too our tale must close. Sleep well and dream gently.